Welcome back, everyone. This is your host, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Katsuki Got Pregnant? A special shout out to the original creator, sapphirebluerubyredroses. Please make sure to show your support by checking out their work from the description. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Shit. Katsuki spat, throwing the little pink stick with its two red lines at the wall. The stick slammed against the wall, bouncing off and along the tile of his bathroom to join all the others that read the same. There were at least a dozen of them. 3 or 4 different brands. As many as he could find on short notice with the cash in his pocket. The clerk had raised an eyebrow at him, but kept his mouth shut as he scanned the boxes. God fucking damn it. Fuck. He wanted to scream. He wanted to cry. He wanted to sleep for the next 9 months and forget what he'd just found out. He wanted to rewind time and make it so he never pinned Izuku to that bed. No, he wanted to go far enough back that he never fell in love with that Deku to begin with. But he'd have to go all the way back to when they were 6, and he didn't think there was any quirk that strong. So, instead he sat on his bathroom floor, knees curled to his chest and palm over his abdomen. What the fuck was he supposed to do? A baby could ruin his career before it had even started. If anyone found out, he would be kicked out of the hero course at the very least and UA at the very worst. Even then, how was he supposed to care for a baby once it arrived? He was a fucking 17-year-old boy, not a 29-year-old Omega with their shit at least somewhat together. There were options, he knew that. Recovery Girl would surely help if he went to her, but there would be no option after that. His secret would be out and he'd be screwed. He could make it through the pregnancy by himself without anyone finding out, he was pretty sure. Until he got too large, then he wasn't sure how he'd explain it. Once he gave birth though, there were adoption agencies or his parents possibly. Maybe Izuku's mother. The Planned Parenthood wasn't that far from the school. All of the Omegas had been given a list and map with them marked on the first day of classes. There would be tests they could run, vitamins they could give him, and if he chose, he couldn't even think the word. If the baby had just been some wannabe extras, someone he would never talk to again, he wouldn't have any qualms about terminating. The issue was that the baby wasn't some wannabe extras. It was Izuku's. His alpha. His partner. His soon-to-be claimed mate. They were going to intern together after the school year was done when they graduated. They were going to live together. His Omega crooned pitifully at the thought of getting rid of their baby, whether through termination or giving them up to the state. There was no way he could. The simplest reason being because he wanted their child. He wanted to raise them together with Izuku and love them as much as he loved their father. Fuck, he hated being an Omega. He hated the instincts that drove him into Izuku's bed and arms. He should have been born an Alpha. But he hadn't been. He'd been born an Omega. Now, he had to take responsibility for his actions. That didn't mean he had to drag Izuku down with him. So, he stood on shaky legs, gathered up the scattered pregnancy tests in a trash bag, and buried his secret in the bottom of a dumpster behind one of the other class dorms. First things first, he booked his ass down to the second closest Planned Parenthood that was 3 miles out of his way. He gave blood. Pissed in a cup. Waited impatiently for 3 hours while they ran the test to confirm what he already knew. Then, they sent him on his way with a month's worth of prenatal vitamins, a handful of pamphlets and a list of checkups he should schedule from month to month as the pregnancy continued. Walking back to the school as the sun fell, he stopped at a park bench. He couldn't go back to the dorms just yet, not knowing that he'd have to look into the others' faces with the face of a liar, with a secret growing inside him. Not know that he'd have to stare Izuku in the eye and lie. Children ran back and forth across a playground as the street lights flickered on, screaming and laughing as their parents watched from neighboring benches, curled into each other. He cried for the baby inside him. He cried for the career he might lose before it started. He cried for the pain he would surely cause Izuku through this secret. And then he just cried. Tears streaked silently down his cheeks as he stared at the colors exploding across the sky and felt the tightening in his abdomen, as if he could feel the life growing in him already. He didn't want this, but he did at the same time. "Excuse me?" "Are you okay, mister?" a little kid shouted at him. He dropped his head and froze. "I'm just pregnant, so—" The little girl was small with wild blonde curls, freckles across her entire face and massive red eyes. When she smiled, it was the whitest thing in the world. "Oh well, congratulations. Here, you can have All Might," she chirped, setting a battered All Might plush on his lap before stepping back quickly. "You look like you need his help. And he's always there for people in need." Katsuki blinked down at the doll and then back up at the little girl, his tears slowly coming to a stop. "He's retired, kid. Didn't your parents tell you?" "I know," she chirped again, "but he still does a lot of stuff. He's my favorite hero. And he saved a lot of people before that too. He helps me every day. I smile every single day even when I don't want to." "Why wouldn't you want to?" he asked, squeezing the plush tightly so the cartoonish smile warped and stretched. The little girl kicked at the sidewalk, staring down at her shoes. "I get picked on because I don't have a quirk and I'm an omega." Swallowing, Katsuki slowly released his death grip and held the doll back out. "I know the real hero, so you should keep this with you. Don't let anyone ever tell you that you can't do something because you don't have a quirk or because you're an omega. It's a crock of shit. Fight. Argue. But don't be a doormat for anyone. I'm an omega, and I'm going to be the #1 hero. My mate used to be quirkless, but he never gave up. Now he's going to make his dream come true. So, whatever you want out of life, don't let anyone tell you that you can't achieve it." Her eyes were wide as she took her doll back and watched his palms crackle with fireworks. She gawked up at him as he stood. "Really? You're going to be a hero even though you're an omega? Even though you're going to have a baby?" "That's right." He jerked his head towards the playground. "Now go back to your parents before they start getting worried." "What's your hero name going to be, mister?" she asked as he stepped around her. He paused. Turning back, he smiled even though he didn't want to. "Ground Zero." Beaming, she turned and tore across the playground to her parents, a pair of women on a far bench. Swallowing down the tears that threatened to spill again, he made his decision then and there. He could see what their child would become, whether they were a girl or a boy. An alpha, omega, or beta. Just like that little girl with her wild curls and wide smile. No matter what he had to do, who he had to hide everything from, who he had to fight, he was going to have this baby and he was going to graduate. When he did that, he was going to climb to the #1 spot with Izuku at his side and their baby on his hip, and he would give them the best life anyone could ever have. "Kaken, where were you last night?" "We were supposed to hang out," Izuku asked in the morning as he slid up to Katsuki's side. None of the others had come down yet. It was normal practice for them to be the only two awake at 6, but that wouldn't last for long. "And you didn't show up for our morning workout. Are you feeling okay?" Katsuki focused on the pan in front of him, the sizzling bacon and crackling eggs, instead of answering. Turning away, he split the pan's contents between 2 plates that were already full with fruits and vegetables. Izuku flipped off the burner and took the plates to a table as Katsuki took the pan to the sink. Before they sat down, Izuku pressed close to Katsuki, skimming his nose along Katsuki's neck and running strong hands over his arms. "You smell a little different. Is your heat on the way? Didn't you just have one?" Pushing him away tiredly, Katsuki took his seat. "It's not my heat," he muttered, head lowered. He was tired from the crying and the stress and a sleepless night. He didn't have the energy to match Izuku's boundless energy today. Looking a little hurt, Izuku slowly sank into his seat. His eyes were like 2 pins piercing right through him to his very soul. If they made eye contact, Katsuki knew he'd figure it out immediately. "What's going on?" "Nothing, I'm just not in the mood. You might be able to fool the others, but not me, Kaken. What's really going on?" His anger, so familiar yet foreign in its pure fire and ferocity, reared its head. "I fucking said it was nothing, Deku. Don't you have ears?" "Jesus," he snapped viciously, standing and storming from the kitchen without looking back. There were tears on his face again, and he was already tired of crying. This was just the beginning though. After he'd gotten back to the dorms and gotten a verbal lashing from Aizawa with a side helping of extra cleaning duty for being out past curfew, he spent the rest of the night researching pregnancy and everything that could possibly go along with it. He knew that the hormones pouring into his system would make him more emotionally volatile than before, than even his heats ever made him. He knew that his scent was going to change over the next few months, maybe even his hair texture and taste buds. He knew his sexual appetite would become insatiable and his nipples would become sensitive and soft as his chest swelled with milk. He knew more than he ever wanted to know about the male omega body. He also knew that if he didn't allow his alpha around him, he'd eventually become depressed from the lack of support and contact. Omega pregnancies were fundamentally different for a typical betas in the fact that, statistically speaking, an omega couldn't make it through without their alpha. They needed the mixing of their pheromones, the stability and care the alpha would give, especially mentally. The omega wouldn't be the only one hurt though, but the fetus would suffer as well. If the omega wasn't careful, they would miscarry. Katsuki hadn't figured out what he was going to do about that little tidbit. He didn't know how close he could let Izuku get just yet. He didn't know how far away he wanted to push him just yet. There was a knock at his door, and knowing who was on the other side, he took only a moment to clean up his face before opening it. Izuku stepped through with their plates of stood, warily following him into the room. "I'm sorry if I pried. I'm just worried," he murmured as he set the food on his small table. Instead of answering, Katsuki let his omega direct him. He pulled Izuku into him, crushing their mouths together and turning them to fall onto his bed. He straddled Izuku's hips, rucking up Izuku's shirt as his desperation and need for touch grew. "Kikakin, what dash? I want you. No. We have class. And the others will be waking up soon. We'll make it if you shut up and get in me," Katsuki panted, slipping his hand between their bodies. When he cupped Izuku through his shorts, he shut up completely. Needless to say, they were late for class, but Katsuki felt far calmer than before. "Kakin, we shouldn't," Izuku whispered below him, mouth swollen and red from Katsuki's kisses, eyes closed in pure bliss as their bodies slid together despite their boxers still creating a barrier between them. Izuku was intoxicating. Had always been. His face, his eyes, his mouth, his voice, his body, his scent. Everything sending Katsuki closer and closer to the abyss of his volatile emotions. It had taken Katsuki the better part of 2 years of high school to pull his head out of his ass to realize that all of the fantasizing and skirting around each other when they were close to their cycles meant something. That it had always meant something. That it wasn't just his body's natural reaction to a nearby alpha, and that it wasn't going anywhere. He was around alphas all day every day, which was just an occupational hazard of working to become a hero, but he'd never once imagined himself being with any of the others the way he almost religiously fantasized about Izuku. The one time he'd tried in first year had resulted in several days of no eye contact with Kirishima. Even after they'd finally fallen into each other, taking that headlong dive off of the cliff they'd always been teetering on, they'd been careful. Condoms. Birth control. Suppressants. They never did anything close to their cycles, Izuku happily bottoming oftentimes, kept their hands off each other during the day as if nothing had changed. Everything had changed as it inevitably would though, and Katsuki was starving. His body was heated almost to discomfort, his cycle right on the cusp of kick-starting, and he needed Izuku. Needed him like a dying man needed water. "Need you, death. Want my mate, want you?" Katsuki rasped against Izuku's throat as he gently scented him. "Need my alpha, Izuku?" Izuku positively keened beneath him, turning his head to catch his mouth again in another slow, searing kiss. Izuku had gone pliant beneath him, following his lead as he stripped them of their boxers and straddled his hips. They'd been less careful that night, indulging in each other. Drunk on each other. Relying on the birth control. Their sex had been different that night, slow and steady and loving as Katsuki took everything his body had been screaming for. He reveled in the heat and feel of Izuku filling him, moving inside him, gripping his hips with bruising force, coming apart beneath him. When they were both panting and sweat-drenched and satiated, Katsuki marked up Izuku as his without sinking in his teeth like he so desperately wanted to. Deep red love marks were his next best option, and he readily used them. Then they lazily made out for hours before passing out together. Katsuki had never felt more fulfilled in his life. Katsuki woke up retching, which was absolutely the worst end to the best dream, and before he could puke in his bed, he hung his head over the side to use the trash can he'd put next to his bed just for that reason. Ugh, he groaned, rolling over onto his back when his stomach was empty. His bed was empty, and he felt worse for the fact that it was his own fault. That night had been one of his best experiences in recent memory. He couldn't bring himself to regret any moment of it, every moment of bliss and touch and silent communication. Even during, he was pretty sure he knew. He knew in his bones that even if they'd used a condom, he still would have ended up pregnant. No matter how careful they were, this would have been the outcome. He'd heard of horror stories like that from other Omegas, but he never thought it would actually happen to him. They were all just stupid. They had missed a pill or forgotten to get their shot, or they were in the full swing of their heat. Something, anything, to pretend like he wasn't like them. Here he was though, reliving a blissful memory and puking in a trash can without his alpha to comfort him. He was no better than any of them. Worse because he was a teenager, still in high school. He didn't regret that night, but it didn't feel worth it in that exact moment with his mouth tasting of bile and his throat burning. Rolling out of bed, exhaustion weighing heavy on him as it did more often than not in the past weeks, he staggered into his bathroom. He readied himself for another grueling day. Another day of constant roiling nausea, of napping on the roof at lunch instead of eating with his friends, of fielding questions from Kirishima, of ignoring or altogether hiding from Izuku. All of it just made him that much more exhausted. He dug out one of the shirts he'd stolen from Izuku's drawers that only smelled faintly of him and pulled it on. The nausea eased just barely, but he hissed as it slid over his overly sensitive nipples. So sensitive that rather than being pleasurable, the stimulation was painful. He hadn't figured out a workaround yet. Women had bras, and he figured that probably helped. Their nipples wouldn't be subjected to the constant shift of fabric. He had half a mind to start tapping gauze over them or something, but he didn't think there would be any explanation that would make sense when the others saw him in the locker rooms. He finished getting ready, biting back snarls of irritation every time the fabric rubbed, and stuffed a bag of ginger candies into his pocket. Training got harder. He knew it would, but he wasn't expecting just how intensely. With his heat, training would be at the very least uncomfortable as those days approached. His body would get heavy, mind wandering more easily, tiredness making a home in his bones, nausea curdling his stomach. Being pregnant was similar to his heat, but 10 times worse for the simple fact that it never stopped. There was never a point where it all became easier, where the nausea faded and he was suddenly wide awake. That, and his tolerance of his idiot classmates had plummeted to levels relevant to his first year of high school. The thing was that his heat had a designated end. He had no idea when this was going to end. He'd read that the symptoms usually faded by the end of the first trimester, but he was 99.9% sure he wouldn't make it through another 2 months. In training, it was embarrassing how hard he was panting from less than half of what he normally did. His head and vision swam, his legs jelly beneath him as they barely held his weight. Luckily, no one was paying attention to him, focused on perfecting their own techniques. Except, of course, for Kirishima, who seemed to possess a sixth sense for the slightest change in Katsuki, whether emotional or physical. In soft quiet moments when his head was nearly empty, he'd had thought that if Izuku hadn't been the only mate truly worthy of him, he probably would have chosen Kirishima in the end. He shook head, trying to clear out the weirdly affectionate thought and his vision. "Hey, Katsuki!" Kirishima started towards him. Katsuki's legs buckled beneath him. Before his hit the ground, strong familiar arms wrapped around him and cocooned him in Izuku's ever-calming woodsy minty scent. He hung limply in Izuku's arms, just allowing himself for inhale his alpha's scent. The first inhale steadied his legs. The next eased his stomach. The last cleared his head enough for him to shove Izuku away from him with a snarl, "Don't fucking touch me, Deku." Izuku's expression was fiercely uncompromising as he glared back, the green lightning of his quirk crackling along his skin and in his eyes. "What's going on, Kakin? Are you sick? Stay out of my business." Izawa and All Might both took steps in their direction, ready to break them apart. Expression hardening further, Izuku took a purposeful step forward. "What is that supposed to mean?" "You're Kirishima slotted himself between them, hands up in supplication and neck bared in submission. He grinned disarmingly. All right, you two, let's not start something right now. You've been doing really good not starting unnecessary fights. Let's not end that streak, yeah? They continued to glare at each other over Kirishima's shoulder, but after a moment, Izuku calmed and softened until he took a step back. You're right. Scoffing, Katsuki turned his back on the pair. He knew Kirishima followed after him when he heard his quick footsteps catching up to him. Maybe you should call it a day. You haven't been in top form the past couple weeks. You should rest. Maybe we can talk? Kirishima asked hopefully, but when Katsuki shot him a glare, his hands raised again. Okay, but at least rest? No. Just the short time with Izuku's scent had nearly completely cleared out his symptoms, and he rolled his shoulders. I don't need a break, I need a fight. Let's spar. Kirishima frowned, but followed him to an empty portion of the gym. Kaken, are you making katsudon again? Katsuki started, and stepped back from the stove quickly as hot oil splashed onto the counter. He hadn't heard Izuku coming up, and that more than anything made him spin with a snarl. Fucking hell, Deku, I'm working with hot oil. What made you think this was a great time to sneak up on me? I wasn't trying to surprise you, Izuku explained quickly, hands up between them as Katsuki crowded his space. I was just wondering. You've been eating katsudon a lot recently. So what? Katsuki turned back to the stove if only to ignore his Omega screaming at him to get closer. To press flush and scent his mate. To wrap himself up in Izuku's warmth. His Omega needed to mind his own damn business. You never really liked katsudon? Izuku trailed off, eyes roaming over him in a hot slide. Katsuki repressed a shiver. You've been eating weird lately. Fuck you. You don't know my diet. Katsuki started serving the food with perfunctory movements onto 2 plates, his cheeks warming under Izuku's scrutiny. He had been eating weird combinations of food recently, and it was equally true that he hadn't really been trying to hide it. The cravings were just too hard to ignore when he finally got back from school to everything he needed to satisfy them right in the pantry. You were eating cucumbers topped with ice cream yesterday? What's your point? You don't like ice cream? That's the weird part to you? Katsuki shoved one of the plates into Izuku's chest, turning to take the other to a table. He scooted in and started shoveling food into his mouth. When he'd been researching, the internet hadn't told him just how hungry he would be. He was hungry all of the time now. Only his willpower kept him from completely overeating. Granted, that didn't stop him from salivating over Sato's pastries until the teen offered him half any time he brought out a snack now. After a moment, Izuku followed and cautiously took the seat across from him. He glanced furtively around at their classmates, but no one was paying attention. Even if they were, their relationship wasn't any of their business to ask about. Without looking up, Katsuki nudged his leg between Izuku's calves, and had to hold back the sigh of utter contentment that threatened to slip out. He bit the inside of his cheek when Izuku affectionately began to rub his leg back. Izuku stilled as he took the first bite, eyes jerking up to Katsuki. He set his fork down. Okay, no really Kaken, what's going on? Katsuki leveled him with a harsh glare. What the fuck is your damage now? If you don't want to eat it, don't. Just give it to shitty hair or some shit. He was tired. He was tired of things not going right. Izuku was supposed to be his constant, but he should have known better. The universe wasn't so kind. When he started to pull his leg back, Izuku's hooked his ankle around his calf. I'm not saying I don't want to eat it. It's good, Kaken, like everything you cook, but it's not how you usually cook. What the hell is that supposed to mean? I can still feel my taste buds. It's very mild. It's nothing how you usually cook. Izuku stared back at him with big green pleading eyes. I'm worried about you. Well, yeah, the food was mild. For the past couple weeks, any time Katsuki had eaten his normal level of spicy, he'd gotten raging heartburn. Even now, even with how mild he'd made his food, he could feel the acid beginning to rise. He'd had to cut back because he didn't want to be eating aniseeds like he at the ginger candy he kept with him. He couldn't very well tell Izuku that, especially because of the reason behind it. Well, he could, but then the nerd would give the whole game away without meaning to. Katsuki wasn't going to be the reason Izuku couldn't become a hero. If he was found out, he'd be the only one to get dropped. Don't. Kaken dash. Izuku, he said lowly, allowing his scent to unfurl like a blanket that had Izuku starting in surprise. Leave it? Sighing, Izuku lowered his head, scent tentatively leaking out around the edges of his control. Okay, I'm here when you want to talk. Allowing himself the barest moment of vulnerability, of wanting his alpha, his mate, he inhaled their mixing scents and said, I know. They finished eating in silence, wrapped in each other's scents, ignoring all the looks being cut their way probably due to how harmoniously their scents were intermixing when normally they'd war for dominance. They did the dishes in silence, and without speaking, found their way to Katsuki's room. It was only when he opened his door that he remembered all of the Izuku's clothes that he'd been hoarding in the past weeks. He'd started snatching a shirt here and there, beginning the construction of the nest he would keep their baby in. When they finally arrived, that is. Most Omegas didn't start building a nest until closer to the end of their third trimester, but it calmed him most days. He would arrange and rearrange the clothes to produce the most potent air of Izuku's scent that he could, and then he'd lay there basking in his creation. When he felt at his worst, he'd just dig out the biggest of the shirts to wear even though it was almost too small for him. He stalled at the sight, mortified. He considered throwing Izuku out, but his Omega was having none of that train of thought. He denied the both of them too much recently. Izuku stopped, confusion clearing in a moment. This is where all my clothes have gone? He mumbled, staring at the nest. That makes sense. Kaken, are you? He trailed off for a moment, cutting a glance at him. Are you going into heat soon? You didn't have one last month. God, Izuku didn't know how much he wished that were the reason. No, I just wanted your scent. He turned his face as far away as he was able to hide the heating of his face. You could have just come to me, Izuku whispered gently, turning to face him, but he didn't return the look. No, I needed this. He tried to come up with a plausible reason, something that wasn't a complete lie, but wasn't the real truth. The stress of everything. We're so close to graduating, but there's still a lot left. Nodding thoughtfully, Izuku turned to look at the mess his bed had become. Yeah, I get it. Can I join you in your nest? Yes. Please, he thought emphatically, 1,000 times yes. Instead of saying that, he climbed into the middle of his nest and lay down facing the wall. The bed dipped slowly with Izuku's weight before he curled around Katsuki and pressed his nose into the back of his neck. Immediately, his chest began to rumble. Alpha. Safe, his Omega sighed. Katsuki promptly threw Izuku out of his nest and bedroom the next morning, and his Omega concurred vehemently. Now that they'd both been satiated and returned to equilibrium, drenched in their alpha's scent, his Omega had decided that he didn't want Izuku anywhere near such a mess of a nest. They didn't even want him to look at it. Their nest had to be perfect the next time they let him climb in. No one wants Omega who can't make proper nest. His Omega growled irritably in this chest. Must be perfect. He couldn't argue with his Omega's logic even if he knew rationally that wasn't true in Izuku's case. He left for school ungodly early, and grit his teeth as he stepped into the support courses workshop. A headache bloomed at the sight of Hatsum's non-stop movement, like she was sucking out every bit of energy and goodwill he'd cultivated over the night. For several long moments, he watched her flitter around erratically, wondering how long it would be before she noticed him. When she just continued on with no idea he was there, he released a rather loud and aggravated growl. Hatsum's pink head swung around, and she grinned manically at him. Bakugu, morning. I haven't finished the upgrades to your dash. He cut her off. Do you have material for armor? Something light and sturdy, but high strength? Something that can cover my entire torso or even just my stomach, but won't get in the way. She cocked her head, considering. It was like he could literally see the hamster sprinting on its wheel in her head. You want armor? You've never asked for armor before. Yeah, well, shit changes. Her manic grin returned full force. I've got the perfect thing. They went back and forth for the better part of an hour before Hatsum finally pulled out something that would work for the time being. It was lightweight, almost like Kevlar, but she explained it had been made by another support student with a metal quirk. It was thin, almost like a shirt, and fit him snugly enough that it wouldn't be obvious under his hero uniform. He'd just have to be careful not to take a direct hit to the stomach while out on patrol or in training. I'll make you a new top for your hero uniform with material stronger than this, that way you don't have to double layer. You can take this with you for the time being though. He stared down at the cloth in distaste. It smelled overwhelmingly of multiple alphas, and his hackles rose. He'd have to sneak it into Izuku's room or something for him to scent. He clutched it in his fingers like a lifeline, the final defense between his baby and the outside world. When he looked up at Hatsume's expectant, giddy eyes, he asked, "Can you double up the protection over the abdomen? I need extra protection there." Her eyes flickered down for the briefest of moments, making him curl his lips defensively, before grinning from ear to ear. "That'll be a cinch. I'll have it ready with your other mods in, say, 2 days? Thanks," he said grudgingly before taking his leave to escape the strange Omega. Shit, he really kind of hated talking to her. Sometimes he actually enjoyed talking shop with her, discussing mods and upgrades and new projects, but she was just too much. She was so energetic about everything, and he always left completely drained afterward. He trudged to class, ready for another miserably long day. Katsuki was more than surprised when he looked at the date and realized he'd made it through the first trimester. He'd already made it through a third of his pregnancy without anyone discovering his tightly held secret despite the midnight snacks of strawberries and mayonnaise, or orange juice and cherries, or apple slices dipped in, of all things, Worcestershire sauce. Ciro, the feck, had a terrible habit of catching him in these moments. The beta almost always gagged at the sight and then again while Katsuki pointedly stared into his eyes as he took another bite. While Katsuki would normally agree, especially with the last, that shit had been good enough to satiate his cravings. In quiet moments, he worried about the kind of things his pup was going to enjoy, but mostly for the amount of sugar he constantly wanted to ingest. He always blamed Izuku for the blooming sweet tooth. No one had found him out despite his exhaustion, doubling up on his food intake, and his constant mood swings. Despite vacillating wildly between needing to be close to Izuku and his friends, and then wanting absolutely nothing to do with anyone a mere hour later. He'd made it through the first trimester, and he hadn't been found out. The thought repeated through his still mind, over and over and over until it was a mantra instead of a statement. His relief was short-lived through because he knew that there was still so much more time to go. Hissing at the sudden spike that shoved through his left eye to leave his head pounding, he was reminded exactly how much longer he had and how many more symptoms he had left to look forward to. He slammed his phone into the rumpled nest that his bed had become with a snarl. Fuck, there was still so much longer. He just wanted it to be over already. The joys of pregnancy and motherhood, my fucking ass, he snarled viciously to himself, scrubbing the unwarranted and wildly unwanted tears from his eyes. As he flung his door open, he thought, at least you don't wake up puking your guts out every morning. Now you just vomit up your stomach every other day. What a blessing. Really, he'd never realized how sarcastic he could be until he had only himself to talk to. Stepping into the common room, Izuku's scent all but slapped him in the face. The nerd was humming as he cleaned away the dishes from his breakfast, seemingly pumping his pheromones through the room unconsciously. Katsuki inhaled greedily without moving, reminded that the clothes in his nest needed to be traded out sooner rather than later if he wanted his nest to remain sufficiently drenched. His headache flared again before the pain was cut into and numbed by Izuku's scent. Izuku's eyes jumped up, surprised, and he stared back at Katsuki. Their scents swirled and mixed as Katsuki's Omega pumped out pheromones in response to his mate being so close at hand, claiming him even when an entire room separated them. Kaminari bumped into his back sleepily and immediately slapped a hand over his nose. Ah geez. Do you guys have to do this whole power dynamic thing all the time? It's suffocating in here. I'm going to smell like you guys all day. Katsuki's Omega purred at the simple idea. Alpha friend. Scent. Ours. Everyone must know Alpha friend is ours. Squashing that voice, he struggled to reel his scent back in, snarling at the difficulty of fighting his own Omega. Kaminari startled, and took several quick steps out of his reach. Are you sure you're an Omega, dude? Like, I don't understand how. You're so aggressive all the time, he asked pitifully, voice nasally and eyes tearing up as he stood nearly immobilized. He pinched his nose closed with 2 fingers, breathing shallowly. Are you sure you're a fucking alpha? You're such a pussy all the time, Katsuki snapped back harshly. He hated being reminded that he should have been an alpha, that he'd been cheated by his own biology. Kaken, Izuku admonished. Rolling his eyes to glare at Izuku, he shot back, oh, shove it up your fucking ass, Deku, before stomping from the dorms. He peed when he got to school. He peed at every break. He peed before and after eating lunch and when the time between breaks dragged on too long. Even now during hero training, he felt the ever-present pressure on his bladder urging him to sprint to the closest restroom. It was maddening. He didn't think he'd ever pissed so much in his life. The worst part being that the pressure was never really gone and the release was never truly satisfying. Very rarely did anything ever come out when he tried. Honestly, he would have taken the pounding headache and roiling nausea over this. At least he could calm his stomach, but what the fuck was he supposed to do about the pressure? It's not like he could reach into his body and rearrange his organs to be more comfortable as the leech inside him was already making major headway on that little project. He should have just accepted the discomfort like everything else instead of wishing for something different. His stupid fucking body was far too literal at times, and he wanted to hollow out his entire body as pain lanced through his eyes and nausea coiled low in his belly. Bile rose in the back of his throat. His moment of distraction proved fatal as a well-placed kick from Kirishima sent him flying. Instinctively, he clamped his arms over his belly instead of extending them to catch his fall. He tumbled across the gym floor before sliding to a stop against the far wall. The only saving grace was that there were no teachers or other classmates around as he immediately rolled onto all fours to turn out the contents of his stomach. Alpha. Get to mate. Help. His omega keened, pumping out distressed pheromones in hopes of attracting Izuku's attention. And attract they did. Kaken! Izuku shouted, at his side in barely an instant, hand pressed firmly to his back as his spine bowed with the force of his retching. What happened? Kirishima tore over, panting out, oh shit. I thought he was going to block so I went full force. Katsuki, bro, are you okay? Do I fucking look okay? Katsuki wanted to scream, but there was still bile in his throat, so he just vomited again instead. Only when Izuku shouted, I'm going to go get Mr. Aizawa, did he find the will to force his body into submission. No, he panted as saliva and bile dripped from his open mouth, latching onto Izuku's thigh to both hold him in place and push himself away from the puddle of sick. Don't you fucking dare, Deku. Kaken. Izuku protested, but winced as Katsuki's fingers tightened. How was there even feeling left with all that muscle? Shitty hair can take me back to the dorms, but... teachers. Bro, I think you really need to see Recovery Girl at least, Kirishima sputtered, voice trembling and stilted as he pinched his nose closed against his pungent scent. The distress his omega had poured out was noxious. What I need, Katsuki snarled lowly, is to be taken to the dorms so I can brush my teeth and go the fuck to bed. If you won't take me, I'll just take myself. He used Izuku as an anchor, pushing himself up on trembling legs to start for the nearest exit. Kirishima was under his arm then, looking back at Izuku. Go. I'll clean this up and let Mr. Aizawa know he wasn't feeling well. I'll bring your guys' stuff back. Kaken, I'll come by to check on you later. Don't bother, Katsuki growled in reply, but silently hoped he would ignore him like he often did. Then he would have a reason to bundle Izuku up in his nest for the night. Kirishima stuck close to his side after getting to the dorms, watching in concern as he guzzled down bottle after bottle of water, showered, and pulled on the clothes he'd gotten Izuku to sleep in for a night to scent properly. Sitting in the middle of his nest as he fiddled with the blanket he'd been stitching for the absolute terror growing inside him, he tried to ignore just how intensely Kirishima was watching him from his desk. How his room so obviously smelled like Izuku. He could almost taste Kirishima's concern on the air, and it had his omega whining back in return. Listen, bro, Kirishima said, breaking the silence and making Katsuki stiffen, I know you're all macho Taninu, but I and Midoriya and all the others are really worried about you. Like seriously worried. I'm not trying to pry into your business or anything, but I want to help. You're my best friend and I don't like seeing you like this. Kirishima was earnest, so fucking earnest that it made heat press in at the backs of his eyes. Tell him. Tell him. Tell him. Alpha friend will help us. Tell him, his Omega chanted incessantly, and he vehemently wished he could stuff a sock don't the wolf's muzzle. Katsuki pinched the bridge of his nose, and before he could think better, muttered, I'm pregnant. Silence. Glancing over, he found tears on sun-tanned cheeks and a stunned expression on his best friend's face. He groaned inwardly as the heat beaded over onto his own lashes. Fucking hormones. 3 months. No one knows, he rambled, turning away before Kirishima could see the wetness in his own eyes and steadfastly threaded his needle into his project, but the tremble in his voice was a dead giveaway anyway, no one knows. And you can't tell anyone, do you hear me? Not an absolute soul, or I'll kill you in cold blood. You may be my best friend, but these stupid fucking pregnancy hormones have made me feel particularly murderous. Still more silence, so he looked back. Kirishima? But how? Don't you need dash? Kirishima stopped abruptly. Who's the father? Do they know? He didn't honestly believe his best friend was this dense, but his classmates were constantly surprising him. No. Didn't you hear what I said? No one knows, and you're not going to tell him either, he snapped. He could see the wheels in Kirishima's brain turning, looking for answers to his numerous questions. But they deserve to know. Yeah, he does, but I'm not going to ruin everything he's worked for if I get caught. Don't you get it? This is a career killer before the career has even started if I get caught. I'm not dragging him down with me. He was worked up, his body hot as emotion flooded his system. Something fluttered in his abdomen, and he worked to calm down. He pressed the heels of his hands over his eyes to stem the flow of tears. Don't you get it? I can't take that from him after everything I did to him before. And you know the success rate of male Omega pregnancies. There's always the chance of I can't. They were silent, sniffling in tandem, for the longest minute of Katsuki's life. Is Midoriya the father? Katsuki didn't answer, which was answer enough. Kirishima's scent got closer, calming sympathy flowing off him in waves. Katsuki and his Omega growled lowly, warning him from putting a single finger on their nest. Kirishima just rumbled in reply. So, this whole time, you've been doing this alone? All the puking and weird food because you're pregnant? How has Midoriya not caught on yet? Katsuki huffed out a strangled laugh. Have you met Deku? He's smart, but he's also an oblivious idiot. Do you know what I had to do to get into a relationship with him? I don't let him sleep in here that often. Kirishima laughed quietly, and his Omega rolled happily at the sound, metaphorically baring its belly for the feeling of community, for the feeling of pack. Yeah, I guess that's true. So, your symptoms have been so bad because you're keeping your mate, he said tentatively, at arm's length? Yeah. Katsuki dropped his hands, and the traitorous tears rushed forward. If he could rip out his own tear ducts, he would have by now. Sitting on the floor as close to the edge of the bed as he dared to get, Kirishima stared with blatant wonder at Katsuki's stomach. It was a telling sign that he didn't immediately try to bite him for the observation. There's really a little life growing in there? A little mix of you and Midoriya? They're going to be a terror. Shouldn't you be, I don't know, bigger by now? Yes, and I don't know. I went to my parents' doctor, and they said the baby is growing normally, so there's nothing to be concerned about. Turning his eyes up to meet Katsuki's, he whispered, Wow, but what are you going to do when you do get bigger? Katsuki grimaced, looking back down at the half-finished blanket. I don't know yet. Hope I don't show? I read that some people don't show the entire time. Kirishima scrunched up his nose. It'd be pretty weird to see you looking like you shoved a bowling ball up your shirt, I do have to admit. His face smoothed and then he was grinning. I'm really glad you trust me enough to tell me. At least I can help now however I can. In the next moment, his grin turned sly, and Katsuki's stomach dropped. So, like you and Midoriya, huh? When did that all start? Face heating, Katsuki snapped, Get out. Kirishima whined, but stayed firmly planted where he was sitting. Izuku was lying on top of Katsuki, head pillowed on his chest and body blanketed, when he shifted to prop his chin on his threaded fingers. He considered Katsuki for several moments before asking, "What do you think about coming out to the others?" Katsuki's phone promptly assaulted him. He batted the offending piece of technology away as pain lanced through his nose and teeth, holding his nose as he glared down at his mate. "Where the fuck did that come from?" "I don't know," Izuku mumbled quietly, tracing nonsensical patterns into the bare skin of Katsuki's chest. He sighed and looked back up. "We've been together for almost 8 months. I want to be able to talk to Ochako, Ida, Todoroki, and Mom about us. I want to be able to sit with you on the couch in the common room and eat with you and hold your hand around everyone without them looking at us like we grew an extra head. All we do is eat together sometimes, and they already do that." He trailed off, cheeks growing pink as he dropped his head down again. Soft lips pressed to Katsuki's skin, breath moist and hot. "And?" Katsuki prompted when it seemed like he wasn't going to continue. He let go of his face, cupping the back of Izuku's neck instead. Another sigh spread out against his skin. Izuku turned his head so that his cheek was resting against his breastbone. "I don't want to have to sneak around anymore. Mostly though, I just want to be able to claim you. I hate seeing other alphas eyeing you like they'd love to get you under them. Like you're a piece of meat." He nuzzled up into the heat beneath Katsuki's jaw, and Katsuki purred in response. "I know it bothers you when other Omegas are talking to me, trying to blanket me in their scent even though they could never hope to cover up yours. Everyone always assumes we smell like each other because we train together in the mornings. I hate it." Katsuki threaded his fingers into Izuku's curls, gently scratching at his scalp until Izuku's chest began to rumble. He hated it too, and in the weeks since coming out to Kirishima, he'd considered the idea multiple times. They had already agreed that they wouldn't officially mate until they'd had a chance to live together outside of high school. That had never been under negotiation. This other secret had begun to wear at him though in the last couple of months when his need for contact had been the highest, stealing kisses in an empty classroom and hidden touches when he really needed them. If he could take what he needed in the light of day, it'd be easier. He thought it would make everything simpler even if it would invite others into their business and unwanted comments, it would just make things easier. He also hated the idea with a passion that rivaled his 15-year-old ire. He hated that people would know this secret little part of Izuku that up until then had been only his. The thought of Pac was an intoxicating plus though. So he said, "Sure, yeah." Izuku's head snapped up, nearly striking him in the chin. "Really? What? You don't actually want to?" "No, it's just that I wasn't expecting you to agree so quickly." Katsuki shrugged, looking up at the ceiling. "They're going to find out eventually. We're not exactly subtle, and I'm sure at least a few know already. They're not all as oblivious as you are." Laughing, Izuku kissed the underside of his chin. That was almost a compliment. "Yeah, well, it had to happen at some point. How are we going to do it though?" "Well, if you tell your dumbass friends and I tell my nosy-ass friends, it'll spread without any work from us. The whole school will literally know before the day is over. The 2 top students dating will be the hottest gossip any of them will hear the entire time they're here. It'll be worse than when Beady Eyes and Amajiki got engaged." "Why do you know Amajiki's name, but not Mirio's?" Izuku asked with a happy little laugh. Katsuki waved away the question. "Kirishima never shuts up about him. You'd think they were the ones engaged. Well, Kirishima is a really loyal friend and gets excited for the people he cares about." "Yeah, sounds like some green-haired dummy I know." He grinned down when Izuku huffed. They settled more completely into each other. It wasn't 10 minutes later that Katsuki felt something very stiff pressing into his abdomen. "Deku," he said threateningly. He could almost feel as Izuku's face flush with embarrassment. "I'm sorry," he whined. "I've been really pent up lately, and we haven't done this in a long time. It's been longer since we've had sex. You haven't been feeling well, so I haven't said anything. I didn't want to pressure you or anything." Katsuki huffed. Like Izuku could ever pressure him. Since getting pregnant, his libido had been admittedly non-existent, unlike his research had told him. Probably because of all the puking and headaches and harboring a literal leech in his body or something. Even now with Izuku's dick pressing into him, The offer of sex wasn't all that appealing when before he would have already been ravaging the idiot. I haven't gone into a rut in months, so I haven't even had that, Izuku mumbled. Yeah, Katsuki thought, that makes sense. They'd learned during this year's sex ed that when an alpha's omega got pregnant, it completely shut off the hormone that caused both parties to have their cycles. All energy went into providing for their omega and growing pup. Something about an evolutionary survival mechanism. He was just lucky Izuku was too dumb to connect the dots. And there were so many dots to connect at this point. Any two would lead to the same conclusion. Katsuki mulled over the concept silently, letting Izuku stew in his embarrassment for a little while longer. We can have sex on one condition, he said, and Izuku startled against him. You're topping. I'm not in the mood to put in all that work. That, and you're always so goddamn loud when you bottom, and I don't want that purple ball-haired pervert listening at the wall. If you bend me into a pretzel again though, I'm never going to let you touch me again. Izuku laughed as he pushed himself up to lean in for a kiss. Okay, I can do that, he said. Katsuki willingly wrapped his limbs around Izuku and melted completely into the heat of his touch. The next morning, they went downstairs to the sound of Sunday morning cartoons in each other's clothing. Izuku slumped in a near-unconscious, whining heap across Katsuki's shoulder. He was a terrible morning person even when it was already 10. Kaken, I'm tired. Let's go back to bed, he wheedled, but Katsuki ignored him. They were completely drenched in each other's scents and pheromones from the night's activities, and their appearance caused the kind of shock that he'd planned on. All heads turned to them in complete silence as he dragged the useless heap into the kitchen to grab several water bottles. He wasn't about to cook for the fucker after getting wrecked by him the night before, so he just grabbed fruit and granola bars before beginning the trek back upstairs. Kirishima grinned widely at him, and he jerked his chin up in silent greeting. As he mounted the stairs, he heard Mina hiss accusingly, "Did you know about this, Eiji? You've been holding out on me, jerk?" "I have no idea what you're talking about," Kirishima replied innocently. "Kirishima," the group shouted in outrage. Katsuki groaned salaciously, melting into his nest with the roll and push of Deku's hot hands against his skin. "Oh yeah, right there, you perfect prefect alpha." "Oh my god." Above him, Izuku laughed warmly, bending to nuzzle into the back of Katsuki's neck. "You really weren't kidding. You're so tense. I don't know how you were even moving. You must have been in a lot of pain. Do you think I'd be bitching if I were kidding?" Katsuki asked, but his voice lacked the usual bite, drunk on bliss. He purred loudly and his back bowed up, chasing the feel of Izuku's hands. "You're so responsive today. It's kind of nice." Izuku moved down his body, kneading away every knot and tense muscle. His hands and lips spent an exorbitant amount of time on his ass, but Katsuki couldn't find it in him to protest. Instead of starting something like Katsuki assumed he would, he continued down his thighs and calves, spending time gently rubbing his feet and flexing every toe before coaxing him into his back and working his way back up. He paused at his hands until Katsuki nearly drifted off, pressing his thumbs into calloused flesh and nuzzling at the cups of his palms. His attention was nearly reverential. It was only when he was straddling Katsuki's hips again, working his arms and chest, that he spoke. His voice dragged Katsuki out of a literal endorphin and pheromone-induced haze, gentle and curious. "I didn't really notice before, but your nipples have changed color." He idly ran the soft pads of his thumbs over Katsuki's nipples. They immediately hardened, and Katsuki shivered involuntarily. "Yeah, they're like a brownish red instead of their usual soft grayish pink." He repeated the motion, and Katsuki's body responded in kind. He wanted to snap Izuku's fingers off for the almost clinical way he was inspecting him, but Katsuki's omega had other ideas. Izuku's expression was alight with fascination. "Does that feel good, Kaken? Your nipples have never been very sensitive, but they're really sensitive now. I wonder why." "I'm pregnant, you absolute lovable dolt," Katsuki thought. "Figure it out already?" Instead of saying that, he bucked his hips to flip Izuku onto his back, following to slot between his spread knees. He pressed their hips flush. "Less talking, more kissing," he demanded, and Izuku surged up to meet his lips enthusiastically. Katsuki had never once imagined how good kissing felt before, but since he'd had Izuku's lips for his own, he could never quite get enough. Afterwards, when they were both properly exhausted and Izuku was lovingly running his fingers through his hair, he whispered, "I really love that you're my mate, Kaken, and I'm happy that we can be together in the open now. I'm the luckiest alpha in the world." The enormity of his secret loomed over him again as it so often did these days, souring his mood. He didn't let the mood take hold, and turned his nose into Izuku's neck in response. Words were still hard. He'd always had to show his emotions through action. As the emotion receded back into its sealed box, he couldn't help but think, "You might not feel that way after you find out what I've been hiding." He shoved that thought into his chest of secrets as well, locking everything away to hold close. Fear reared its head when Aizawa called him into his office after class one day. He had to consciously repress the anxiety in his scent as he gingerly sat on the couch that took up too much space in the tiny room that was connected to the rest of his rooms. He felt enclosed, captured, like the walls were bearing down over him and would at any moment clamp down on top of him. The anxiety only built when Aizawa didn't say anything, only continued to sip at whatever was in his mug. Katsuki hoped it was vodka to make him less perceptive, but he knew he wasn't that lucky. He just hoped he was lucky enough to make it through this meeting with secrets and faculties fully intact. "How are you doing in classes and with training?" Katsuki startled, narrowing his eyes at the unexpected question. Aizawa sighed tiredly and leaned back in his seat, crossing an ankle over his knee. "Calm down, Bakugu, you're not in trouble. This conversation would have started very differently if you were." As Katsuki unfortunately knew firsthand. "I am calm, sir." Leveling an unimpressed look at him, Aizawa said, "I can smell your anxiety from here as much as you're trying to hide it, trouble kid. Like I said, you're not in trouble." That really didn't make him feel any better, but he tried to slow the tripping rhythm of his heart. "You know how I'm doing. You're my teacher." "Analytically, yes. On paper, I can see how you're doing, how much progress you're making, what shortcomings you're working through, your grades. Paper can't tell me how you're emotionally holding up. You and your classmates haven't had an easy 2 years here, and it's my job to make sure you graduate at your full potential, or at least as close to it as I can get you." Aizawa took another sip before setting the mug down and crossing his arms. "I've been seeing some strange behavior from you since the start of the year. A de-evolution of your devotional training schedule and dietary habits. The exhaustion I've observed from you during training and class would be normal for everyone else with how hard you push, but not for you specifically. And as barely sociable as you were before, you've almost completely isolated yourself from everyone except for Midoriya and Kirishima, it seems. While I don't think this is the case, I am obligated as your teacher and mentor to make sure you are still in good mental health. So, I'm going to ask you a question that will make you extremely uncomfortable. Are you harboring any suicidal ideas or have you ever or considered intentionally harming yourself?" Katsuki's brain completely shut down for the duration of an entire minute as he tried to internalize the literal insanity of that question. Finally, he sputtered, "What the fuck? Everything I just talked about can be symptoms of depression and suicidal thoughts. You wouldn't be the first student I've intercepted before doing something stupid. You wouldn't be the first student to feel like that if you do. You can see how I'd be concerned about you, especially in an individual like yourself whose habits have not changed in 2 years." "I'm not suicidal," Katsuki shouted indignantly. "Then do you still want to be a hero? What the fuck kind of questions are these? Of course I still want to be a hero. I'm not going to let that damn nerd be number one. Who do you think I am?" Aizawa sighed grudgingly. "Someone with a lot of drive, but also a teenager under a lot of stress. Your scent has changed, did you notice?" "So?" Aizawa stared back silently. "I am not suicidal," Katsuki reiterated. How selfish would he be to be considering suicide with a helpless life growing inside him that hadn't gotten a say in the matter? Then what? Scents don't just change. Is it the stress? Depression? Anxiety? Something else I'm not aware of? He was just not going to let up, and Katsuki swallowed as heat flooded his cheeks. Deku and I are mated. At the beginning of the year, he wanted to combust and crawl his way down to hell. Aizawa leaned his head back on the edge of his chair, closing his eyes. Yes, well, the sexual education system is extraordinarily lacking in terms of how a mating bond changes you, and that explains it. It also gives me more insight into your personal relationships that I am, frankly, uncomfortable with. He raised his head again, grimacing as he did. Well, now I'm obligated to have a different discussion that I was not prepared for. I'm going to take the benefit of the doubt and assume you're being careful. Despite the low probability, you know what will happen to your career if you get pregnant while at school? Katsuki's face was hot for several different reasons now, and he worked desperately to reel in his scent. I'm not stupid, he grit out even though he definitely absolutely was. He was possibly the stupidest person on the face of the planet. But his teacher didn't have to know that. Good. I advise you stop by the nurse's office to get on a course of birth control. Use protection if you decide to get physical. You can go now. Katsuki was out of his seat like someone had set him on fire, and all but sprinted from the room and out to the grass behind the dorms. He inhaled the cooling air until he'd calmed down enough to stop pulling at his hair. Sitting on the steps, he stared up at the treetops where the sun was quickly burning the sky away. There was a flutter, a turn in his stomach, and he stared down at his own body in wonder. He knew that at some point he'd be able to feel the baby moving, but he hadn't expected it. Even less he'd been expecting the rush of love and excitement that flushed away the vestiges of his discussion with Aizawa. He placed a tentative hand over his stomach, and there was the flutter again, as if they were responding to his touch. The tears came in a torrent, and he pinched the bridge of his nose. God fucking damn it, he whispered miserably. Bakugu? Oh, fucking kill me now, he growled before peeking over at Izuku's best friend. Why couldn't he just have one moment where someone didn't catch him crying? What do you want, round face? She smiled gently before tilting her head back towards the dorms. Let's talk. I have something I want to talk to you about. Jesus, he bit out, but more out of obligation to his mate than actual want to talk to the only other Omega in their class. He dried his face and followed her inside. Katsuki was not expecting an honest-to-God shovel talk when he followed the small brunette into her room. He really wasn't expecting it when she set a cup of peppermint tea in front of him and curled her legs beneath her on her bed, a steaming cup in her own hands. It was uncomfortably familiar to how Aizawa had started everything, and the fluttering in his stomach became nausea rather than his baby moving. What do you want, round face? I'm not really in the mood for a chat, he muttered gloomily, staring down at the cup. He was intensely aware that she'd seen him crying, and he hated the thought. Only Izuku, Kirishima, and All Might had ever seen him cry save for the singular time his parents had when he'd presented. He was severely off balance from the thought. Ochako pursed her lips for a long moment before saying, I'm going to put this very simply and bluntly, Baku. If you ever hurt Deku, I will kill you and make it look like an accident. I'll rip out your throat and bury you so deep that by the time you're found again, the term will have gone from grave robbings to archaeology, and mark my words, you will not have a grave. You'll drift from memory as the hero that never was. Do you understand? Her voice was calm, almost cordial, but the look in her eyes. She'd definitely learned that from Izuku. Katsuki laughed without humor, bracing a hand on his forehead as heat pressed in at his eyes again. Why do you assume I'm going to hurt him? Well, you have a notoriously bad track record for being nice to him. You've hurt him more than you will ever know, and he's working really hard to get over everything you put him through. Honestly, I think this whole thing is just a disgusting form of Stockholm Syndrome. I'm not going to let you hurt him like that again. Another hollow laugh. You don't have to tell me. I know well enough. I don't need your meddling, nosy ass to tell me. But we're mates. It's different now. Is it? The tone in her voice had changed, becoming hard and harsh. Flat like he'd never heard her voice go before. Then why haven't you told Deku that you're pregnant? Katsuki's head snapped up, and the tears escaped before he could stop them. No. No. And underneath the shock was anger. Ochako huffed, setting her cup down on her beside table. Don't look so surprised. I'm not an idiot. 1 + 1 = 2, Bakugu. One being the frankly weird shit you've been doing and the other being stuff from Deku. Before you get mad, It was just him honestly gushing about your relationship? Actually, the anger had been thinking Kirishima had outed him for reasons he couldn't father. It was more than a relief to know that his best friend still knew how to keep his mouth shut. I'm not stupid, and neither is anyone else, but as a fellow Omega and a woman, I know my fair share about pregnancy because I made the effort to learn about my body. That, and well, a stint as a kid where pregnancy fascinated me. My point still stands. If I figured it out, there may be more people suspecting. She trailed off, eyes tracking over his face. Then again, probably not since no one else is an Omega. They probably think you're acting weird because of the new mate bond. Katsuki didn't answer, and reached for the cup as he felt the burn of bile at the back of his throat. Ochako sighed, and the hard expression she sported dropped into her more usual soft expression. She grabbed her own cup. They drank in silence until Katsuki couldn't take it anymore. Slowly, he bent until his forehead pressed to his knees and choked out, "You can't tell him. Please. Don't hurt yourself there, Bug," she said, voice light. He snapped back up, anger boiling in his stomach. "Don't take this so lightly, round face. I'm being dashed." She cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Serious, yes, I am taking this seriously. I'm an Omega, Bakugu, and a woman, like I said before. I know what this means for the both of you if the wrong person finds out. I'm not stupid and I'm not heartless. I want to see all of us become heroes." She smiled softly before her smile fell away, becoming serious again. "But you've been reckless. You need to be more careful with your body." "I'm being as careful as I can, but I can't back down too much or I'll get caught." She sighed. "Fair enough." Pressing her fingers together, she pursed her lips. "You're going to have to tell him eventually, especially before the birth. He literally has to be there. You know the success rate otherwise." "Yeah, I've done my fucking research, Ochako. I'm not a goddamn imbecile," he growled. "Honestly, you could have fooled me," Katsuki snarled in reply. "But for the sake of my best friend and his career and for the baffling love he has for you, I'll support you as much as I can. That way you'll give birth to a strong, healthy baby. The fact that that baby is going to make him literally the happiest person in the world is the only reason I'm being nice here. Jesus, between you and shitty hair, I'll be getting enough paternal pheromones that Deku won't need to be in the picture," he groused, but that was a lie. No one could ever replace Izuku. "Dirty lies," Ochako chirped. Katsuki thought that would be the last of it, but one talk turned into Katsuki teaching her how to sew and knit, which ultimately turned into long quiet hours of putting together onsi after. He wanted to hate it, he really did, but the feeling of growing his tiny little pack of soon-to-be 5 was intoxicating. So he indulged. Izuku being excited about him making friends with Ochako was only an added bonus. Just like that, Katsuki had made it through 2/3 of his pregnancy. He frowned down at his phone, completely disbelieving. The past 6 months had gone by in the blink of an eye, even with how long the first trimester had seemingly lasted. This trimester was easier, far easier with how minimal his symptoms had actually been. 3 months. "I have 3 months left until I meet you, you little monster," Katsuki thought idly. Warmth bloomed in his chest and embedded itself in his cheeks. "Yo, Kaken, what's that look on your face? You almost look happy," Kaminari shouted right in his ear, clapping him on the shoulder as he went back to shoving his things back in his bag. "Get the fuck off me, dunce face," Katsuki snarled viciously, snapping his teeth at the blonde and slinging his bag over his shoulder. Without looking, Izuku's hand familiarly slipped into his even as Izuku continued talking to his own group. Kaminari's eyes dropped to their intertwined fingers, and Katsuki stared pointedly until he glanced back up with a wider smile. "No, like, seriously. It's like you're glowing all the time now. So fucking weird. It kind of scares me." Katsuki's face tightened dangerously as he smiled back. "Are you trying to have a funeral, dunce face? I can arrange that for you right now, if you want." A hand came down over Kaminari's mouth, and Kirishima smiled widely as he steered him away. "Your mouth is getting away from you again, Danks. Wershinso. Maybe you can run it at him for a bit." Before they could leave to find the aforementioned hero in training, Mina grabbed them by the back of their school uniforms. "Don't go anywhere. We're going back to my room, remember? She asked brightly. I'm not, Katsuki said automatically. I've got shit to do. That being a movie and shamelessly cuddling Izuku in his nest. Well, really, they were going to go to the new hero expo that Izuku was all but salivating to go, and then he was going to cuddle the alpha shamelessly. He wasn't in the mood to be dragged around for hours, but he was in the mood to spend time with Izuku. Mito! Come on! Mina whined, and Izuku turned with raised eyebrows. You know how long I've been planning this. I know you're what he's talking about. You don't know shit, raccoon eyes, Katsuki spit back, gripping Izuku's hand more tightly. Izuku responded, fingers flexing in his. He smiled. It's okay. You should spend time with them. I know you don't like how crowded expos can get. Ida and Ochako said they wanted to go, so I won't be alone. We can still get together afterward, and that way I can bring back something we haven't watched 6 times. Katsuki grimaced, but after a moment, sighed. Fine. Mina and the other idiots hooped. They danced around as Izuku pulled Katsuki close with a hand on the back of his neck. He scented Katsuki liberally in the view of everyone and their mother, rubbing their necks together. Katsuki's omega purred contentedly, and when Izuku pulled back to kiss him, he took the chance to make it a little less chaste than Izuku had intended. They pulled away with a dopey smile on Izuku's lips. He giggled. Have fun. I'll see you later. Yeah, you too, Katsuki murmured before Mina forcefully pulled him away. That's still so weird to me, Kaminari complained. Like, not only are you gay but the blatant PDA? I thought for sure you were just asexual. Maybe. I'm really just decusexual. He decided to keep that to himself. Okay, Kirishima sang, that's about enough out of you. He turned Kaminari away with an arm slung over his shoulders before Katsuki could shut him up for good. Nah, man, Shiro butted in, blanketing Kirishima's arm with his own. All their fights were totally charged with sexual tension. Mina laughed, pulling Katsuki along by his hand. You two are really trying to get hurt today, aren't you? A beer sat in front of Katsuki like it had been since he'd been forcefully pushed down at Mina's desk, sweating profusely in the rising temperature of the room. It had probably gone lukewarm an hour ago, but he wouldn't know. He'd been hanging onto the tea Kirishima had discreetly passed him, but he'd started to use the water from the bottle to draw on the desktop. Around him, the group was loudly arguing about who would win in a fight. Pre-retirement All Might versus the original Hulk. When Shiro had drunkenly started shouting about Captain America, Katsuki had almost exclusively tuned them out and just let his omega marinate in the feeling of community. If he hadn't been pregnant, Katsuki would have enjoyed a beer or two and enthusiastically joined in the discussion, but as it were, he was. And the smell of booze and the swirling mix of his friend's scents were starting to make him a little sick. Only Kirishima's grounding hand on his knee kept him from bolting. Thankfully, he'd also been fielding any attempts to draw him into conversation. He didn't see Mina approaching when she flopped into his lap and wrapped her arms around his neck. Kaken, are you having fun? She sang, and he contemplated shoving her off him. Weirdly though, he could tell that she wasn't even tipsy. He actually couldn't remember seeing her take a drink since the party had started, and the realization disquieted him. Not nearly, he told her truthfully as Kirishima tried unsuccessfully to prise her off. She pouted. Ah, you don't like us any more now that you've got a boyfriend to entertain you? Whoever said I like any of you to begin with? He sneered. Drink with us, she whined. You haven't even touched your first beer. Don't want to, he grumbled and went back to his drawing. He was trying to figure out what he wanted to put on the onsi he and Ochako had been making. They'd researched how to make reusable cloth diapers, and he'd have to think of a design for that as well. Katsuki stiffened when her sticky lips pressed to his ear and whispered, I know your secret, Katsuki. I know why you're not drinking. He had shoved her from his lap and was out of his seat before he'd even made the conscious decision to get up. His omega snarled a warning in his chest as she blinked owlishly up at him from the floor. I'm leaving, he snarled, and he was out the door. The silence of the room broke as Shiro slurred in annoyance. Mina, what did you say to him? Nothing, I'll go talk to him, she said placating. He was already stomping down the stairs when he heard her door slam and her footsteps run to catch up. He sped up, almost sprinting down the stairs. He really hated this whole thing where he had to go all the way to the first floor to get to the boys' staircase. While he understood its necessity with shits like Mineta in the dorm, it was making it extremely difficult to run from his quick-footed friend. She caught up with him on the third floor of the boys' side. "Katsuki, slow down. Let me explain," she panted as she sprinted up the stairs behind him. "Fuck off, Mina," he roared back, and then he tripped, barely catching himself from cracking his knees on the landing to his floor. She took her chance, tackling him to the ground and pinning him there. He struggled and snapped at her, but Mina was incredibly strong for her size. Unless he wanted to hurt her by flinging her down the stairs, he wasn't getting away so easily. "Get the fuck off me." "No. Let me explain," she shouted back. "No. You think I want to talk to you after that?" "No, but I want to talk to you about it." "How did you even find out?" Against his will, his rage was leaking away to be replaced by pure exhaustion. How many people knew? Had he really been that careless? If that was the case, did Izuku know and just decided not to say anything? That wasn't like him. Mina sighed, grip loosening. He took the chance to buck her off, and she careened over him. They lay panting for several moments before she decided to say anything. "I followed you the day you found out. I was worried because you were acting so weird. I saw you throw the bag away. I saw what was in it." There was a resounding record scratch in Katsuki's head, and it took him a moment to understand. "You followed me?" he shouted, twisting onto his forearms to glare at her. "You went through my trash?" "I was worried," she whined back, holding herself up on her arms to look at him. "Honestly, fuck you. Who does that?" Pushing to his feet, he strode past her as she scrambled up behind him. "Fuck off, Mina. I don't want anything to do with you right now," he snarled even as she shouldered into his room past the door he tried to slam on her. "No, we're going to talk about this," she said adamantly, standing by his door instead of following him deeper into his room. "Good," he raged silently, "or I'd blow you up in an instant." They glared at each other, him safely in the mess of his own design of clothes and cloth and thread, and her by the door. He snarled a warning when she took a step forward. She huffed. "Look, I wasn't completely sure until just now. You never refuse so much to drink with us. You always have at least one drink even if you bitch about it the whole time. I wasn't going to say anything." "Then why did you?" "Because AG clearly knows, and for whatever reason, no one else does." Well, her eyes took in the mess, the pervasiveness of Izuku's, Kirishima's and Ochako's scents, him and Cheiko apparently. Mito clearly doesn't know or he would be acting way more possessive. Why? Katsuki remained silent. He wasn't about to so liberally give up his secrets to someone who had ambushed him in a place where he should have been safe. Is it even his? A growl ripped from his throat before he could stop it. Did she really think that lowly of him? Then what? You're just planning on giving birth and giving it up for adoption? Do you even want it? You couldn't stomach an abortion, so you're going to do all of this for nothing? She asked meanly, lips curled. He flung his arms out to encompass the room, the fabric and the half-constructed onsi and the smell of his room. "Them Mina, they are them not in it. You really must think so highly of me to think I'd go through all of this and not want to keep them. Go fuck yourself with any uncomfortable device of your choice. As long as it fucking hurts." In an instant, her face smoothed out and she grinned at him. The sudden shift in mood had him suddenly off balance. "Just checking. Didn't think I could forgive you otherwise." "Mina." He sat heavily in his desk chair, carting a hand through his hair. How many people knew? Who was going to out him? What was he going to do if they did? It's not like he could just kill everyone. That wouldn't solve as many problems as he wished it would. Hurry up and get here, little monster. My heart can't take much more of this. Mina dropped to the ground, crisscrossing her legs and seemingly getting comfortable. He had a very sudden and violent image of ripping out her throat with his teeth. Now there was an idea. "So you're what? 3 months out? 2? You're so close." 3, Katsuki grumbled, flopping his head back and closing his eyes. "Now get out." "What? I want to have girl talk." "I'm still a fucking man, Mina. There is no girl talk that we can share. I just happen to also be able to have pups." Our pregnancies wouldn't even be the same. Make friends with someone else. Mina was quiet for a moment. Can I at least join in the next time you and Cheiko get together for crafts? I don't know how to sew, but I can learn. And I'm great with designs. Her voice was small and coaxing. That was something he could work with. Fine. Yes, she squealed before returning to normal speaking volumes. I haven't told anyone, you know, and I won't unless you want me to. Well, that's fucking obvious, or no one would shut their fucking mouths or leave me alone. Let's keep it that way. Sure thing. We should get back to the party though. The natives are probably getting restless, and I doubt you want them to see this. Katsuki lifted his head. You go. I wasn't in the mood before, so what makes you think I'm any more in the mood now? You know they'll ask more questions for days if I come back alone. Just come back with me. Mito will come back soon, and then you can go off and do whatever it is you two normally do. I hate it when you make sense, he grumbled, but stood. He took a moment to hide away his projects before following her out. When they got to the stairs, she pressed a quick kiss to his cheek. Thanks for trusting me. I don't really have a fucking choice in the matter. Nope, she chirped and took the lead. Katsuki glared at his reflection in the floor-length mirror Mina had mounted on her closet door. His pants hung low on his hips, open so he could stare at himself. Between his hip bones, he could see the small bump gently distending his abdomen like a very small tumor. A very, very small tumor that at any point in the next 2 months could blossom into a full-fledged beach ball, but he doubted that it would this late in the game. Thank God for that. His jeans didn't fit like they used to anymore, both because of his still rather rigorous workout schedule, but also, there was a squishy layer of fat around his waist. He was fucking developing love handles, and wouldn't stand for that. Not only that, but his chest had begun to fill out more. It distressed him every time he pressed against his pecs and felt the squish instead of immediately meeting firm muscle, and his nipples had started to leak a watery white substance every time he did. He knew it was just his body getting ready for the baby that would be welcome to the world soon, but it didn't make him happy. He didn't have to be happy about any of the changes to his body, much less almost milk leaking from him. He'd hated the whole concept and process of pregnancy before, and he still hated it now. Like he'd said to himself multiple times, the joys of pregnancy, my fucking ass. He was absolutely not thrilled that he'd had to improvise pads to soak up his weird nipple liquid so he didn't leak through his everyday clothes. Bakubro, what are you doing over there? Don't you, have a date or something? Kirishima asked from the bed where he, Mina and Ochako were spread out agonizing over the mass amount of homework Aizawa had assigned for the weekend. He's already finished it, and Kirishima and Mina had dragged him down, grabbing Ochako on the way when they spotted her in the halls. An impromptu meeting of the Baby Boom Protection Squad, as Mina had started calling them. I'm getting fat, Katsuki growled, still staring at himself. Even his face had lost a little of its sharpness, and not to puberty. He couldn't handle it. Catch him the very day he gave birth pressing weight like a madman with a newborn strapped to his chest. He couldn't live like this. Ochako lifted her head from where she'd been face down against her book, blinking blearily up at him. I don't see anything, Bakugo. If there is something different, then I can't tell. You look the same as ever. Which is to say hot. Which is not fair. I'm not going to look that hot when I'm pregnant. Then I guess you can't see this baby bump either, he growled, turning to pull down the waistband of his briefs a little lower for their appraisal. The three aspiring heroes scrutinized his abdomen before sighing in unison. I don't see anything, Mina whined, rubbing at her forehead. I'm still a little bitter about being robbed of big pregnant Bakubro, to be honest. How are you not even showing? That'd be so weird if he were though, Kirishima said, dropping his head back down. Katsuki sneered over at them. Just because you're alphas doesn't mean you get to slack on knowing what your omega's pregnancies are going to be like. Everyone's bodies are different and every baby is different. That goes for betas and female alphas too. Not everyone is going to look like a pregnant woman on television. Right? Ochako piped up, my aunt is small like Jair. When she was pregnant, she didn't show until the second trimester, and even then, it only looked like she was carrying around an apple under her shirt. Point made. I'm most likely not going to show at all. Thank God for that. And I don't want to show. Fuck all of that. But come on, Mina wheedled. You would look so cute all big and round. Imagine how dramatically Mito would die seeing you like that. He wouldn't be able to stop touching you. Like I'm ever going to let him touch me again after this, Katsuki sniped back, zipping up his pants with finality. You're such a liar. Ochako jumped in before the conversation could veer too far off track, and returned to the original point. Anyway, if there are any changes, it's no wonder you notice them. It's your body after all. You would notice any small changes first. Well, you and Deka maybe? Yeah, don't remind me. I've been avoiding that fucker like the plague whenever we get back from school so he doesn't smell this tit juice on me. Ew. Mina screeched, sticking out her tongue in disgust. Why did you have to describe it like that? Kirishima sighed. Or you could just tell him, you know, as the father of your child? Solve one of the problems. Katsuki snarled and glared at him as he pulled on his improvised padding and then his undershirt before layering over his button-up. Yeah, no thanks. That shit would give the game away, and I'm almost at the finish line. Okay, whatever you think is best, Kirishima conceded, but the look on his face told Bakugo all he needed to know about what his best friend thought of that particular course of action. Stubborn ass. Whatever. On the plus side, you look great. Ochako chirped, smiling. I always look great. God, he was hungry. He wanted ice cream, and he glanced down at his phone for the time. There was still another 30 minutes before Izuku was supposed to come back from his errand. He turned for the door. Eyes wide at the sudden change of pace, Mina asked, "Where are you going?" He glanced over his shoulder. "To get ice cream." The three scrambled after him out the door. "Wow. You guys are eating ice cream without me?" Kaminari cried indignantly when he found them in the common room crowded around a table with an empty carton of ice cream and 4 heaping bowls. "And you ate it all too. Should have gotten here faster instead of having a disgusting PDA session with your boyfriend and girlfriend," Katsuki said as he deliberately stuck his spoon in his mouth. "You're one to talk." Katsuki raised an eyebrow. "I didn't realize my boyfriend was sitting in my lap. You guys should have told me. I would have shared." Ochako snorted into her bowl and smacked around fruitlessly for a napkin. Katsuki silently pushed her napkin against her searching fingers. "That's not fair." Kaminari shouted before grumbling, "Should you even be eating that? You've been putting on some weight recently." Right around the middle. He indicated the region, sweeping his hand over his stomach and waist. "And here." He pointed at his own cheeks. Katsuki stopped breathing as anger boiled up. Mostly anger at the liars sitting at the table with him. "Man, who says stuff like that?" Kirishima complained before Bakugo could blow up and ruin the whole treat they'd been enjoying. "Yeah, that was so mean, Danks," Mina chimed in with a frown. "Bakugo is as fit as ever. Where did that even come from? Did the date not go well?" "It went fine." Kaminari uncharacteristically spat defensively, but tears were bubbling up on the rim of his lashes. Thinking about it, Katsuki hadn't seen him come in with either Jairu or Shinso. His Omega whined plaintively, and with a growl, he kicked out the chair near him. "Get a fucking spoon, sit the fuck down, and don't start crying. If you get tears in my ice cream, I'll kill you. Do you understand?" Kaminari slouched off to the kitchen to grab a spoon and slumped into the chair before scooping out a small bite from Katsuki's offered bowl. They ate in repressed silence until Izuku came through the doors with Shinso, looking surlier than normal, and Jairu, looking rather put out with wet eyes, behind him. Kaminari didn't look up, and Izuku sighed as they got to the table. "Here come the class alpha, pack leader, whatever the fuck, to the rescue." He took the spoon with a mound of partially melted ice cream that Katsuki offered him before leaning in for a kiss. Their mouths were sweet and minty, and Katsuki could have stayed there forever. But Izuku pulled away after a moment. He handed back the spoon and gripped Kaminari's shoulder. "Come on, Kaminari. Let's go talk, all 4 of us." He looked to Katsuki apologetically. "Can you give me another 30, Kakin?" Katsuki waved him away, shoving the rest of his bowl at Kaminari before diving into Ochako's proffered bowl. The 4 walked away, Izuku in the lead, and back outside the way they'd come. "I wonder what happened," Mina mused. "I know. Those 3 always get along so well, I thought," Ochako piped up around a full mouth. Don't talk with your mouth full, gremlin, Katsuki scolded before waving his spoon around. Isn't it obvious? It's pre-post-graduation drama bullshit. Most likely. None of them are applying for the same agencies or even in the same city, and with all three being alphas, it's probably mate-related too. Mina and Kirishima glanced at each other. They'd dated back in second year, but had decided to see if they could find omega mates before settling down together. Katsuki was pretty certain that no matter what happened, they'd still end up mated with a gaggle of pups in tow. Alpha-alpha matings, fundamentally different from alpha-omega and alpha-beta matings, had a low success rate primarily due to their biology telling them to go fuck themselves. If any alphas could make it work though, it would be those two. He never talked to me about any of that, Mina mumbled. Yeah, well, you have shit hearing. It's not that hard to figure out if you just pay attention. That, and he only ever talks to Deku about that shit as far as I can tell. I just happen to be there sometimes. Perks of being mated to the pack alpha. Katsuki also knew how to keep his trap shut, clearly. Kirishima sighed. That'd be too bad. Kaminari is head over heels for both of them. Yeah, Mina sighed as well, and Katsuki scowled as the mood soured. Hey, sad sacks, quit with that shit. My hormones are too high for you all to be sad. Ochako interjected before either of the pair could shove their foot in their respective mouths, opening up a conversation for what they thought finals would be like and what agencies they'd been considering. Katsuki fell into the rhythm of conversation, but was out of his seat when Izuka finally came back inside with tear stains on his shirt. He huffed as he wrapped his arms around Katsuki. Let's get out of here. Everyone is too emotional right now. I'm drained. Agreed. Pain ripped through Katsuki's abdomen, exploding out through his entire body. With trembling hands, he gripped his stomach and gasped out, Alphage help? He was so hot, hotter than any heat had ever made him before, and he was terrified. He could feel his baby, distressed and flaying in his body. Their tiny little feet pressed out desperately against his skin. They were too big. Why was his baby so big? What was going on? He needed help. He needed to help his baby. Alpha, Izuku. But he was alone in some side alley, his hero uniform ripped to shred and body trembling. He could hear the battle still raging outside the alley, but he couldn't see anyone. When had he gotten there? How had he gotten there? Where was the blood coming from? The blood. There was so much blood. On his hands. Coating his legs. Growing in a pool beneath him. Another wave of pain ripped through him, and a torrent of blood flooded from between his legs, gushing and warm. No, he croaked as he felt his baby's movements slow. No. You can't have my baby. But whatever god may have heard him wasn't listening. The blood continued to flow, growing faster while his baby's movements only grew slower. Alpha, he called out desperately, flinging out his scent as far as he could. Still, no one came. No, that wasn't right. A shadow filled the opening to the alley, and it shambled forward, hands shoved deep into pockets. Guess we were wrong to try for you after all. There was a sneer in their voice, harsh and reveling in his pain. You can't even protect your unborn pup from your own body. What a useless hero. Fear roared up in Katsuki louder and hotter than before. Desperately, he called out, Izuku. Katsuki woke with a strangled gasp of Izuku's name on his lips, his scent overpowering in his room. He clutched at his drenched shirt over his abdomen, blinking into the darkness around him. His heart hammered in his chest. Gasping, he slapped around until he found his lamp and switched it on quickly. Soft amber light banished the darkness, but he still wasn't comforted. The now oft-repeated nightmare hung over him like a layer of miasma. A quiet, mewling Izuku slipped out before he could stop himself. There was no one in his room to see him. That was the problem though, and he wrapped his arm around his stomach and curled his knees close to his chest. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. I'm not. I swear. I'm not. He jumped when someone knocked tentatively at his door, but he didn't move. The knock came again. Kaken? Is everything all right? Your Omega was calling out. Bolting off the bed, he jerked his door open and pulled Izuku through. He wrapped him up close, pressing his face into his neck. Did you have a nightmare again, Kaken? It was only a dream, Izuku whispered sleepily, voice soft and soothing as he ran a hand down his back. You're safe. I'm here. Hey, don't cry. And he was crying. Shoulders shuddering. Tears hot on his face. It's over. Was it one of the usual? Izuku effortlessly lifted Katsuki in his arms and took him to his nest. He settled them there, Katsuki cradled in his lap, arms strong and warm around him. No. A new one? I couldn't protect someone who is important to me. I couldn't stop it from happening. He whispered in spurts and stops, grip tightening in the back of Izuku's shirt. I was so fucking useless. I couldn't even protect someone who is helpless. It was just a dream. Whoever they are, they're still alright. It's fine. Everything is fine. Pup. Tell him. Keep Pup safe, Alpha, his Omega whimpered. I'll tell him today, he promised silently, and let Izuku comfort him. Katsuki was fucking pissed. Primarily because the sidekick he'd been patrolling with had told him to go home early. He knew he wasn't in top form after the abysmal night's sleep with his nightmare still haunting him, but he'd thought he'd been hiding it well. Secondly, he was pissed because he was feverishly hot and now achingly horny. Those were the only things his mind could really focus on as he found Izuku alone in the locker room. He was fiddling with a broken clasp on his glove, looking more battered than usual after a patrol with Endeavor. It had been more than half a year since he'd felt the almost primal urge to pin Izuku to the ground and ride him until he was the only thing Izuku knew. Curiously, his Omega was wary in his chest, but he ignored that for pushing Izuku against the lockers. Crowding Izuku's space, he worked his fingers into his belt, jerking at the material to get it to loosen. How the fuck did he get this stupid utility belt off again? He couldn't remember. His mind was a haze of heat and lust, but he wasn't above tearing his uniform to shreds if Izuku didn't start getting undressed. Kaken. What ash? Get naked. I need you and me this time yesterday. Immediately. No arguments. Hurry the fuck up, Deku, he panted, kissing up the side of Izuku's throat to nip at the tender skin beneath his jaw. Hurry the fuck up before Icy Hot comes back. He already went back to the dorms for today, Izuku stammered, wrapping his fingers around Katsuki's wrists and holding fast. He struggled, but Izuku only tightened his grip. Kaken, when did you go into heat? You should have called me so I could take you back to the dorms. That was really dangerous. A bucket of ice water dumped into Katsuki's system, and he stilled. What the fuck did you just say? He asked numbly, the haze of heat fading at his words. Now, he was present enough to think. Present enough to hear the worried whine from his Omega vibrating against his breastbone. Present enough to actually feel what was going wrong. How wrong it was. Izuku's frown deepened. You're in heat. Didn't you feel it coming on? Doesn't it feel familiar? No, in fact, it did not feel familiar. He hadn't gone into heat for 8 fucking months. No, it did not feel familiar. It's weird though. I don't feel my rut coming. I don't really even smell your heat. We've never been out of sync, Bivdash. Katsuki's nightmare crashed over him, and his knees went weak with horror. Take me to a hospital. Fear roared through him, overshadowing everything else in his body. He and his Omega simultaneously pumped out their pheromones in cloying waves, filling the room with the noxious scent of their fear and mounting distress. What? No, I have to take you, Dash. Take me to a goddamn hospital, Izuku. Izuku's nose twitched, and understanding, or at least acceptance, dawned on his face. He released Katsuki's wrists but caught him immediately as he collapsed to his knees. Okay, but we need to change. I need you to tell me why though. No. There's no time for that. We have to dash. He was hyperventilating, could barely gasp out a single word. There was no strength in his body in the only moment he needed it to be there. This fear was paralyzing, so much worse and different than anything he'd ever felt before. Different from battle, from when he'd feared Izuku, from when he'd been told he was an Omega. It was so incredibly different from when only his own life was on the line. We can't go to a hospital in our hero uniforms, Izuku said gently, lowering him to the floor and crouching in front of him. Please, Kaken, what's going on? He was trying to blanket Katsuki in his own calming scent, but there was nothing he would be able to do to calm Katsuki right now. He grabbed for Izuku, fingers trembling, and whispered, "Please, take me to a hospital. There's no time." Izuku got them. Changed quickly, and they were lucky no one was in the hospital waiting room. Silently, while they both continued to panic, they were led into an exam room. Izuku was left outside while Katsuki changed, had a vial of his blood taken, his vitals checked, and asked pertinent questions about his condition. When Izuku was finally let back in, he was crying. "Kaken, please, what's going on? What's happening?" he whispered, searching for Katsuki's hand on the exam table. His palms were soaked, but still, he took Izuku's hand and squeezed tightly. "Wait until the doctor comes in." They stayed like that, the clock ticking away every semblance of calm Katsuki had ever had. The minutes felt like hours, only pushing him closer to joining Izuku's sobbing. Silently, he prayed as hard as he could to whatever god or goddess might be listening to him. "Let them be okay. Please, anything you want, I'll give you anything you want for them to be okay. Please, 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 not my baby. Not my baby. Anything but my baby." The doctor opened the door with a wide smile, chart open in his hands. Closing the door behind him, he sat down and turned to face them. "You can calm down, Mr. Bakugu, everything is fine. And you too, Mr. Midoriya. I'm guessing your panic came from the sudden onset of your heat?" Katsuki nodded silently, staring fixedly at the doctor, urging him to hurry the explanation along. He could still feel his heat bubbling in his veins, but there was only the warmth now. Nothing else. He didn't glance over as he felt Izuku's eyes boring into him. "That can happen. I assume you did your research?" Katsuki nodded again. "So, I assume you know what Braxton Hicks contraction are or spotting. It's similar to that. Being in Omega, things are a little differently oriented down there for you, so you wouldn't exhibit the same things as a beta female. It's true that a sudden heat can be the precursor to a miscarriage, but you're far enough along that that's less likely than you may think." "Miscarriage?" Izuku whispered almost silently. Katsuki stiffened beside him. "Yes. Sometimes early in the stages of pregnancy, a heat can indicate the start of a miscarriage due to the internal Omega attempting to become impregnated immediately as they would be the most fertile at this time." The doctor continued, but didn't seem to notice the change in mood as he flipped through Katsuki's chart. "It can be induced by a number of things, but in your case, this is only your body getting ready for labor. Everything is opening up in preparation for the birth. It's perfectly normal, and nothing to be worried about." "Labor?" Izuku squeaked, voice several octaves higher than normal. "Yes, you are. 36 weeks along, which is a little early, but again, not uncommon, especially with how much stress you are not unlikely under. No need to worry though. You are completely healthy, and your pregnancy hormones are nominal." The doctor glanced up with another smile. "We'll run a few more tests for the baby since you're here. I'll be back in just a moment with a nurse." He was gone before Katsuki could wonder if he'd run mediator in the mounting shitstorm brewing at his side. "Baby?" Izuku's voice had nearly crested the frequency out of hearing range. Katsuki could feel rather than see him turn, and he braced himself as Izuku's voice dropped dangerously. "Kaken, what was he talking about?" "I was going to tell you." "Oh yeah? Next week? 2 weeks? When you were going into labor and literally couldn't be there without me?" "Today?" Katsuki grit out. He could feel his temperature rising, the stress pushing out any relief he'd been feeling before. The juxtaposition of Izuku yelling instead of him was not a situation he was particularly a fan of, but he deserved it. 36 weeks, Kaken?" Izuku burst out, ripping his hand from Katsuki's and jumping up to stand in front of him. "All this time you were pregnant, and decided not to tell me? All of the weird stuff you've been doing because you were pregnant? How long have you known?" "Right after that night. I was certain 2 weeks later." "This whole time?" Izuku nearly screamed. "What would you have done if you'd miscarried because I wasn't around enough? Would you have even cared?" Katsuki's heart stuttered at the implication, and he wrapped an arm around his stomach as if trying to protect his baby, their baby, from the onslaught. The tears he'd been holding back finally spilled over. He growled, "Stop yelling at me. How can you ask a question like that? How could I not?" He was still yelling, his face red and tear-streaked as green lighting flickered around him. He always did lose control of his quirk when he got emotional, even now. Of course I fucking care, Izuku. I've cared this whole time. They're our baby. I've been terrified that might happen, Katsuki whispered because it was the only volume where his voice didn't shake. I've had nightmares about it. The nightmare last night, they're our baby. How could you think I wouldn't care? I've never cared so much about someone I haven't even met yet in my life. Then why? Slowly, the atmosphere calmed along with his voice. Katsuki breathed shallowly, and he hiccuped, betraying his tears. Because I want us to be heroes, but if I was caught, at least you'd still make it. Is that wrong? Why do I have to keep repeating myself? Izuku was quiet for a moment, processing that bit of information. You said you have to keep repeating yourself. Who else knows? Just tell me someone has been helping you, that you haven't been doing this completely alone. Swallowing again, he said, Kirishima, Mina, and Ochako. I told Kirishima because he was freaking out. Ochako figured it out on her own. Mina is just nosy. Thank God. Izuku's arms wound around him tightly, and Katsuki held onto his shirt with everything he had as his shoulders shook. I'm so glad you're okay, both of you. God, I'm so glad. I'm sorry, Katsuki choked out because there was nothing else he could possibly say in this situation. I'm fucking sorry. I know, Izuku whispered into his hair. I'm going to be mad at you for a long time, but I know. I love you, you stupid, stubborn asshole. They stayed there, crying into each other, until the doctor sheepishly came back in. Together, they listened to their pup's strong heartbeat and watched in unadulterated wonder as they stretched and pressed a foot into the wall of Katsuki's womb. Izuku cried silently the entire time, and when the doctor handed them printouts from the monitor, he huddled over them. Do you already know the sex? Do you want to? No, they said in unison. But they're small and growing slowly, but healthy. It's typical for male omega babies to be smaller than normal for various reasons. They're probably the healthiest baby I've ever seen, the doctor said as he patted Izuku on the shoulder. You're both very fortunate. Most male alpha-omega couples aren't. Hang in there, you two. They're almost here. When they made it back to the dorms and were safely cloistered in Katsuki's nest, Izuku whispered, I'm still pissed. Katsuki was wrapped around him, stomach pressed flush against his back as their pup moved and stretched and pressed their feet against Izuku's spine. This was the most they'd moved throughout Katsuki's entire pregnancy. He hadn't realized just how much they needed him and Izuku to be in concert together. Yeah, not surprising. I deserve it. Trembling hands wrapped around his arm, holding tight. You can't hide something this important from me. Again, you're my best friend and mate. We're supposed to be able to tell each other everything. So, please, don't keep stuff from me anymore even if you think it's for my own good. Katsuki tightened his hold. If there had been any space left between them at all, it was gone. This is the last time. I promise, he said, and for the first time in a long time, he was being completely honest. Kaken, did you ever think that I wouldn't want pups just yet? Yes. Do you want a baby right now? Not really. There were other options. Did you consider them? Yes. Why didn't you take them? Because I wanted them even then and I want them now. Even if it meant I couldn't graduate and become a hero. I knew you'd want them too because you love me. So if they had been someone else's, you would have terminated? Yes. Why? It wouldn't have been the same situation. I don't love anyone else. Kaken, you know I love you more than anyone else, right? Yeah. I love you too, nerd. Katsuki wasn't entirely sure what had happened. One moment he'd been standing off against some D-list villain, the others fighting their own around him. The battle was huge, larger than any the city had seen before. Bigger than the battle with Overhaul and his gang. No one had expected the battle to get so out of hand. No one had expected a battle at all. In the next moment he couldn't breathe as he rocketed back through the air. In the split second before he hit the ground, he curled his body close to protect the life inside of him as best he could. Slamming into the ground, he grit his teeth against the scream of pain that rocked his body. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't really see. There was too much pain, too much panic, too much everything as he felt wet warmth explode between his legs. He curled tighter into himself. Protect my baby. My pup. Protect my baby. Are they okay? Where did I get his? Protect my baby. Izuku, he grit out as a shadow fell over him. A growl exploded from his abused chest, loud enough to hear over the surrounding battle. He cracked open his eyes just enough to see the villain standing over him, vicious grin wide as the horizon on his ugly-as-sin face. He could barely pull in enough breath to yell, "Izuku!" The villain leered over him, fingers twitching at his sides. Ground Zero needs someone to protect him? I always knew you were pathetic. Kaken. Izuku's voice was saturated with terror and that rage particular to alphas as he slammed feet first into the villain, blasting him away. He was nearly feral as he followed the villain out of sight, teeth bared. No. Alpha. Help. Distress. Pup. Help. Help. Help, his Omega called out, but Katsuki grit his teeth as his torso screamed. Holy shit, Katsuki. Kirishima. Alpha friend. Help. 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 Katsuki couldn't even talk as the pain rolled through him again, sharp at his spine and increasing as it moved towards his abdomen. Under his arms, his abdomen had gone hard. Panic bloomed hot in his chest. This pain was far more intense, and he screamed, "Izuku! Kaken!" Izuku roared back, but he was still fighting. He flew back through Katsuki's line of sight, arms crossed tightly over his bloodied face, before bursting forward again. Kirishima's face filled his vision, completely void of color as he gripped his shoulder. Blood traced down his cheek from his temple, stark against his pallid skin. Katsuki, are you okay? No. Does it look like I'm okay? He wanted to shout, but didn't have the lung capacity to do so. Need Izuku Alpha Dash, he panted harshly, sacrificing an arm to grip Kirishima's wrist. Now. I'll get him. Kirishima bolted away. Deku, Katsuki needs you. I'll finish this. There's something wrong. There was a resounding crash, and then Izuku was filling his vision. Kaken, where did you get hit? What's dash? He shut up immediately as Katsuki hissed out a scream. He couldn't breath. Couldn't breath. Couldn't breath. The pain was only getting worse with each moment. Around them, the battle was winding down, and Izuku's head popped up to gauge the situation as the ground trembled beneath him. Katsuki clawed at him helplessly to bring his attention back to the situation at hand. The very real, very important, very terrifying situation at hand. He couldn't see, but he could feel the hot liquid that had soaked through his pants growing beneath him. Kaken, what's, oh my god. Izuku's face paled as his eyes flicked from Katsuki's face down his body. He was completely white as he shouted, no. No, 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 no. Bundling Katsuki into his arms, he launched them into the air. The baby, Katsuki moaned, mind foggy with pain as he sunk his nails into Izuku's shoulder. Help our baby. They're going to be okay. You're both going to be okay. Izuku sobbed, tears streaming down his face. I've got you. Everything is going to be fine. They were descending, and Katsuki felt Izuku brace for the impact. When they hit ground again, Katsuki passed out. Please, someone help. Katsuki was shot back into consciousness with a scream. A frazzled nurse ran forward, eyes wide as she took them in. Sir, what dash? Izuku didn't let her finish. He got hit, but I don't know where. Please, help him. Please, he's pregnant dash. A sob exploded from him as his whole body shook. Please help my mate. Save our baby. There was a flurry of activity around Katsuki that he could barely understand through his haze of pain. More shouting, a gurney beneath him as they ran through the halls. They passed in a blur of white walls. He kept a vice-like grip around Izuku's fingers and another around his stomach. The pain was starting to numb him, clear his brain as it did when there was too much. Izuku talked rapidly to the personnel around them, explaining everything to the nurses as he was wheeled into a room. The door slammed shut. Save our baby. Save our baby. Save our baby. Please save our baby. The mantra continued on a reel in his head. He was barely mentally present, all his energy focused on breathing and willing their baby to be okay. He only came to when Izuku was ripped from him. Izuku fought desperately to get back to his side as Katsuki reached for him again. What are you doing? Bring him back. Sir, please calm down. We need to get him stable before we can assess the fetus dash. He's 9 months pregnant. The nurse's face was red, and she tersely tried again. Sir Dash. He needs me. The movement around Katsuki never slowed even as another nurse, taller and bullier than the first, stepped up to hold Izuku back. Katsuki was stripped of his suit. And 4 was pressed into his arm, monitors pressed to his skin. The rapid rhythm of his heart filled the room, speaking to his panic. A hand was pressed to his chest, holding him still. Under Izuku's desperate snarls, he still heard the doctor speaking, and against his will, he began to calm. The baby has a strong heartbeat. No signs of distress, but he's in labor. We need to get him transferred to a birthing room before the alpha goes feral. He has broken ribs. Don't worry about me. Katsuki forced out a vicious snarl, making the activity halt. He'd never been a normal omega, far from it, and he was sure they'd never heard an omega sound like an alpha. Especially an omega in labor. Our baby comes first. So if someone tells us to calm down one more time, I will rip their fucking throat out. Help my baby, he gasped. The doctor, a beta smelling overwhelmingly of clean laundry, calmly observed him. Your baby is going to be fine, ground zero, but if I don't heal you first, you're not going to be able to give birth, and unfortunately, C-section isn't an option for male omegas. This is a really dangerous time for you and your baby. They're fine right now, but if I don't heal you, they won't be. Do you want to endanger your baby? Are you fucking Do you? Katsuki found the breath to scream, no, pushed along by another rolling contraction. Then let me work, and we'll get you into a birthing room as soon as possible. She looked up at Izuku, voice stern as she directed him. Alpha, get over here. He needs skin-to-skin contact. Keep him calm while I work. He's going to need you to keep him conscious if the injuries are as bad as I think. He's got a punctured lung at the very least, and if there's also internal bleeding, this is going to take a lot out of him. Undress to your comfort level, and get on the bed with him. Izuku stared at them, shock and fear still on his face. He didn't move. Damn it, Deku. Katsuki snapped before another contraction hit him. This time, he had the presence of mind to grit his teeth against the rising scream. Fuck, get over here. Why does this fucking hurt so much? I thought contractions weren't supposed to be bad at first. Izuku stripped to his boxers and climbed into the bed with him, leaving his hero uniform in a crumpled heap on the floor. He pressed into Katsuki's side and his tear-stained face into his hair. Yes, well, this is just the beginning, ground zero, the doctor said as her hands grew almost uncomfortably warm on his skin. She started at his throat and moved down. But it's only so bad because of your injuries. It won't be as bad for a while after I'm done. Now, take as deep a breath as you can. Katsuki inhaled shakily, just a shallow inhale, and gripped Izuku's hand tightly. He could feel something in his right lung knitting back together, and it immediately became easier to breathe. As she reached his ribs, though, there was an audible crack. He grunted, biting into his lip. Copper and salt burst across his tongue. Compared to the contractions, though, it was barely a mosquito bite. You're a tough one. Any other person would have passed out. The warmth grew more comfortable, and the heart monitors slowed to a more normal rhythm. Don't look down on me, Katsuki snarled past his teeth. Izuku carted his fingers through his hair, chest rumbling gently. The doctor's smile never wavered. Several minutes later, she pulled back. Well, looks like you didn't have any internal bleeding, luckily. Okay, let's get you into a birthing room. She nodded towards the nurses that had stepped back, and they swarmed the bed. Several hours later, they were still in the birthing room. Katsuki's thoughts were pleasantly fuzzy thanks to the epidural they'd shot him up with as soon as they'd gotten into the birthing room. Izuku was passed out at his side, mouth wide and drooling, and he took the chance to unashamedly start scenting the idiot. There was a moment before Izuku sleepily started to blink, and then he was crying again. Oh God, Kaken, I'm so thankful you're okay. I wouldn't have, without you, I should have made you stay out of the battle. I'm a terrible alpha. Katsuki smiled through the drugs, too fucked up to get angry. He gripped Izuku's jaw until his cheeks squished. He laughed at the absolutely ridiculous expression. Let's be real, you wouldn't have been able to keep me back anyway. And no one was expecting there to be a battle, dummy. I'm stubborn, remember, And so it this little monster in me. They're the strongest of the three of us. But what if Izuku squeaked out through his squashed mouth. Katsuki's grip tightened minimally. Oh, stop. I'm fine. They're fine. Stop thinking about the what-ifs and be fucking grateful. Neither of us thought I'd get hit in a fight that wasn't supposed to happen, so just shut up and kiss me. Izuku pressed forward enthusiastically, and they made out for several blissful moments before the door cracked out. Izuku was out of the bed and on his feet immediately, crouching low and defensively in front of the bed as Katsuki's own growl joined his. Aizawa stepped in looking unimpressed. Chill out, you two, I'm not the enemy, he said with a roll of his eyes. We have a lot to talk about, and there's some idiots behind me who are very eager to check on you. Katsuki's ears pricked as he picked out the telltale hiccups of his best friend. Before he could stop his drug-addled brain, he said, "Let him in." Aizawa poked his head outside, and said, "Let me do the talking. If you two get too excited, I'll send you back to the school." As soon as he stepped back from the door, Kirishima burst through. He was a full-on mess of tears as he rushed forward with all might on his heels, but stopped a couple of steps into the room at the sight of Izuku's defensive stance and flickering lightning. He dropped onto all fours, crawling forward to Izuku's feet, and bared his neck in pure submission. He was still sobbing messily. "How are you even hydrated enough to still cry, shitty hair?" Katsuki quipped, and only then did Izuku relax and return to his side. "Can I?" Kirishima sniffled, staring up at them. Katsuki nodded, and Kirishima had his arms wrapped around his neck in the next moment, scenting him aggressively. "I'm so glad you're all right. I was so worried. It took forever to find you, and then they wouldn't let me in, and then fucking breath, AG, holy shit. You're getting snot on me, you gross fuck?" Kirishima calmed marginally, but didn't let go. Katsuki threaded a hand into his hair, holding him close as Izuku climbed back into the bed the other side. He should have felt confined with so many bodies pressed in around him, but he and his Omega were just basking in the warmth and comfort. "Young Bakugo, young Midoriya, I'm happy to see you two are both alright. How was the birth?" All Might asked from his spot beside Aizawa. "Well, the baby is as stubborn as Kaken, so—" "It hasn't happened yet," Izuku explained wearily, eyes trained on their teachers. Mr. Aizawa Stop. I'm going to assume the two of you have known this whole time?" A deep blush darkened Izuku's cheeks, and Katsuki wanted to go back to kissing him. Wow, he really was high. "No. I found out last month," Izuku whispered. Kirishima pulled away, wiping at his eyes. "I've known for, 6 months?" Aizawa pinched the bridge of his nose. "I have no idea how you hid this for 9 months. You know how much trouble you're all in." "A heaping pile?" Katsuki asked, grinning. The epidural seemed to make it impossible for him to feel anything other than happy. "More." Aizawa was silent for a moment before sighing. "Luckily, the hospital staff has agreed to keep this quiet. The only thing anyone knows is that you were hurt during the battle, and Midoriya brought you here. You're also incredibly lucky that the armor you were wearing kept the child safe. If the villain had hit you any lower, that might not be the case. So, thank whatever god you believe in for that." "I only believe in myself and Izuku," Katsuki interrupted. "Whatever. So, let's talk about what's going to happen." Aizawa pulled a chair from the bedside to sit in front of them, crossing his legs and leveling a glare at them. "Principal Nizu already knows the situation. If this had been discovered earlier, you would have been dropped immediately, but seeing as you're already about to give birth and there are only 3 months until graduation, it's been decided to allow you to stay." Izuku and Kirishima whopped even as tears started to track down their faces again. Aizawa's face seemed to soften minutely, his scent filling the room in a comfortable, calming haze. "There are some conditions. You'll be moved into a room with Midoriya due to the nature of the situation. I assume you've basically been sharing a room as is?" They nodded silently. "Right. You'll be allowed to keep the child with you since there is literally no other option." "But," Katsuki prompted, his irritability slowly growing. The epidural must have been wearing off. That, or there was another wave of contractions beginning to crest. "But if any of you can't keep your grades up, yes, Kirishima, This includes you as well, and any others I find out were in on this or your performance drops, you will be immediately dropped. If anyone asks why you have a newborn with you, your cover for the time is that you saved them during battle. Their quirk makes it impossible for you to be separated, and you have to take care of them until their parents are located. After graduation, you are free to disclose any information you wish. Understand? Katsuki laughed. Like I would let a baby keep me from becoming a hero. Don't look down on me. Wouldn't dream of it, trouble kid. All Might was wringing his hands at Aizawa's side, but remained silent. Katsuki opened his mouth to say something else, but stiffened when pain rippled through him. He stared to pant, and everyone but Aizawa looked at him in concern. Get out. I'm about to start screaming again. When Kirishima stood to follow their teachers, he latched onto his shoulder. Stay. A look of surprise passed over his face before he smiled and sat back down on the edge of the bed. Sure thing, man, I'd love to. Katsuki laughed. You won't be saying that soon. We'll be back in a few hours to check on you, All Might said, lingering in the doorway before letting it close. They were in that birthing room for 27 straight hours before the doctors started to urge Katsuki to push. Fuck you, Deku, you useless piece of shit. I'm going fucking skin you and make your insides your outsides, bastard. Katsuki screamed at the top of his lungs as he crushed both Izuku's and Kirishima's fingers until their bones creaked in his grip. You're never going to touch me again, do you hear me? Never. You fucking did this to me, asshole. Garbage alpha. I'm going to make shitty hair my alpha after this since you're such a useless bag of dicks. You're just a fucking Deku. Between his knees, the doctor's shoulders were trembling with laughter. Izuku and Kirishima sobbed at his sides, gripping each other's shoulders for support over his head. His omega thrilled in his chest despite the pain. His alpha, his pack, and soon a baby. It was everything his shitty omega had ever yearned for. You're doing great, Bakugo, the doctor said when she finally got her laughter under control. You're crowning, so just another really good push or two, and then it'll be all over, alright? Grinding his teeth, Katsuki ignored the feeling of being ripped out at the seams. He gripped the hands in his tighter and pushed. I fucking hate you so much. A scream ripped from his throat, and then relief washed through him. He fell back onto the bed, panting harshly as tears streaked hot down his cheeks from closed eyes. Izuku swooped in, pressing kisses across his sweaty face, laughter on his lips even as his hands started to purple. You were so amazing, Kakin. You did so great. I love you so much. Love you too, idiot, Katsuki whispered. There was a breath, and then he stiffened as a loud cry split the air. Struggling to open his eyes, Katsuki pushed himself up on trembling arms until two arms wrapped around his back to help him. The three stared at the doctor's white-clothed back in anticipation. The cries grew in volume, angry and fussy. That was the most manly thing I've ever seen, Kirishima whispered. Trembling more than Katsuki was as the doctor turned with a giant smile and a pink bundle in her arms. She's a little small. Only a teeny-tiny 4 pounds even, 16 inches long. One of the main reasons you didn't show. She's healthy though, very hungry and very angry, she said, scooting in between Kirishima and the bed to lay her in Katsuki's arms. She's beautiful. You did really great. Now, I'll send someone in about an hour, alright? She stepped back, looking at Kirishima. You should get back to school, Red Riot. The new parents need to rest. Katsuki snarled, he stays. You're not going anywhere, shitty hair. Bakuga dash. No. The doctor sighed, but nodded. Well, if you insist. I really don't need a new Omega mother on a rampage. Someone will be by to heal your hands. I heard breaking bones with that last push. But you should at least eat and rest. It's been a long day. She was gone in the next moment. Katsuki ignored everything in favor of staring down at the little bundle that was nuzzling insistently against his clothed chest. Greedy little shit, aren't you? He asked fondly and glanced up at Izuku. Help me get this stupid fucking gown open. I can't move my arms. Carefully, Izuku and Kirishima lowered him back to the bed before extracting their arms. Smiling down at the pair, Izuku reached over to start untying the front of the gown. Red stained Kirishima's cheeks, and he stuttered, I'm going to go find some food for us while you do that. Don't get embarrassed now, shitty hair. You just watched me give birth. There's nothing worse than that, Katsuki quipped tiredly, but Kirishima just grinned back as he headed for the door. Okay, Izuku said, glancing up with an enamored, dopey smile before he could leave. Thanks, Kiri. Katsuki hissed as hard gums latched onto his nipple. Katsuki was out before Kirishima returned, and he woke up hours later from a deep and dreamless sleep. He was clean, the sheets beneath him crisp and devoid of blood and other bodily fluids. Blinking sleepily, he turned his head to find Izuku completely knocked out, snoring in his oblivion. Their baby girl had been fashioned with a tiny diaper and lay splayed bare against Izuku's equally bare chest. His heart fluttered in his chest at the sight. Reaching over, he gently ran a finger over the soft green fuzz covering her head. She mewed at his touch, shuffling and nuzzling along Izuku's chest. Come here, little monster, you're not gonna get anything out of him, he whispered softly, lifting her slowly from Izuku's chest and cradling her against his own. She latched onto his offered nipple without fuss, sucking greedily. Katsuki stroked her pudgy cheek, smiling. He'd done this. He'd made this little gift. He'd never upstaged this achievement for as long as he lived. You look just like your dumb dad. Katsuki? Kirishima asked sleepily from a chair on his other side, scrubbing at his eyes as he sat up. How are you feeling? Like shit, but the endorphins have pretty much dulled the brunt of it, Katsuki explained, looking over as he scooted the chair closer. His eyes were wide, mouth parted in astonishment as he stared down at her. He reached out but stopped. Can I? Does that hurt? There were deep purple bags beneath his eyes. No. After a heartbeat, Katsuki said, you can hold her after she's done if you want. Kirishima's eyes widened even further, sparking brighter than ever. Any traces of exhaustion were scoured from his face. Really? I can? What about Deku? Katsuki rolled his eyes. That's a dumbass question. He just let you stay while I pushed this little shit out. I think he'll be fine. He paused, considering his next words. Your pack. He wouldn't dare. Awesome, Kirishima whispered before glancing over at Izuku. He was kind of freaked out when I got back. Guess you just passed out after I left. It took me a while to calm him down. He was literally in tears while the doctors fixed the bones in our hands. After I got him to eat though, he passed out just as quickly. You two have been through a hell of a lot today. He really loves you, you know? I know. Kirishima was quiet, and then he smiled brightly. Are you hungry? There's food waiting for you. Don't know how good it'll be at room temp, but I'm about to eat my own fucking hand, but I'll wait until she's done so I can have my hands free. I don't really want to get crumbs all over her. Sure thing. Kirishima's attentiveness as he watched the baby eat was almost uncomfortable, but Katsuki knew he was just curious, so he let it slide. It wasn't every day that he got to see a baby breastfeed, especially from his friend. It was another 10 minutes before the baby's mouth went slack. At Katsuki's nod, Kirishima got up to set the wrapped sandwich, a banana, and a bag of chips in his lap. Bring the chair as close as you can, Katsuki instructed, and Kirishima sat so close that his chest was pressed to the railing. Okay, be careful. Hands where my hands are. Support her head and butt. Yeah, like that. I'm going to pull my hands away, don't freak out. She's really light. Don't hold her too tight. Yeah, like that. He watched Kirishima like a hawk as he ever so carefully sat back. She's so small, oh wow. She's beautiful, Katsuki. She looks just like Deku. Kirishima's face was the definition of in love as he stared down at her. He was clearly as enamored as Izuku. What are you going to name her? Doing up the ties of his gown, Katsuki grabbed for the food. Through a massive bite of bread and meat, he mumbled, Izuku wants to name her Katsuki. Kirishima nodded. Yeah, that's perfect for her. I can already tell she's gonna do amazing things. Whose last name are you using? Both of ours. Bakuga Midoriya. Kirishima nodded again. They fell into silence while Kirishima nuzzled her and Katsuki wolfed down every crumb of food he'd been brought. He sighed when he was done, still a little hungry, but not as much as before. He watched Kirishima and Katsumi, an unconscious smile curling up his lips. Before he could think better, he said, Izuku and I only talked about it briefly, but we wanted to ask if you wanted to be her godfather. Only if you want. Kirishima's head jerked up in surprise, and Katsuki groaned as tears spilled over onto his cheeks. Oh my god, stop crying already, shitty hair. It's fucking irritating, and my hormones are all fucked up right now. I'm not okay with crying because of you. Kirishima only started to cry harder. They were stuck there for another day before Aizawa dispatched Mina and Ochako to come collect them with a change of clothes. They cooed annoyingly over Katsumi while the three men changed, and Katsuki had to fight back the urge to rip them to pieces when he came back to collect her from their clutches. Back off, vultures. Stop touching her, he snarled as he pulled her from their arms. They whined in tandem, but Kiri gets to hold her. Why can't we? Because I don't want your scents on her. Back the fuck off before I hurt one of you. Don't touch my baby again. They whined further, still crowding his face until Izuku none too gently got between them with a tight smile. They quickly backed away at the quiet growl he let out. It had been a long 3 days for Katsuki, Izuku and Kirishima, and it had worn even Izuku's nerves thin. Kirishima had been there the entire time, but even though the two heroes were pack, they hadn't been around. They were pack, but it was different. Katsuki smirked, flashing a vicious smile at them. The women stuck out their tongues in reply. They left quickly after that, and when they arrived at the dorm, Kirishima, Mina and Ochako ran interference as Katsuki and Izuku bolted upstairs to Katsuki's room. They barricaded the door. Dropping onto the bed, they settled into the comfort of familiar surroundings. It was more of a relief than either of them had realized, especially to have a proper nest. After a shallow breath, laughter spilled from them. We're fucking parents, Katsuki gasped, hand pressed over his warming face. Holy shit. We did it. You did it. Izuku pressed his face into Katsuki's neck, smiling like the fool he was. Yeah, we're parents. They continued to laugh, tears in their eyes, until they heard a tiny giggle from between them. When they pulled apart in shock to stare down, a slit of red eyes and toothless gums stared up at them. Katsumi giggled again. Izuku let out a happy cry as the tears in his eyes fell, and pulled the pair into his chest. Oh, I love you two so much. Didn't even know babies could laugh at 2 days old. Her laugh is beautiful. Katsuki smiled against his neck. Yeah, it is, he laughed. Katsumi snuffled, making noise for the first time since the class period had started. Without looking up from his notes, Katsuki started to purr low in his chest. He reached between his body and the sling. He kept her in to open his shirt enough to tuck her head against his chest. Immediately, she latched on. He only stiffened for a moment at the sharp pain that reawakened from his abused nipples before settling into the familiar rush of endorphins. Katsumi didn't always want to eat when she woke up, but they'd gotten her on a pretty good schedule. Katsuki also seemed to possess a preternatural understanding of what she wanted before she started to cry, which helped because he could barely stand the crying. He knew that before getting pregnant, and it had not changed. If she was fussy, Izuku usually took her without comment to find a place to soothe her. Katsuki studiously ignored the way Jairu was stared across the short space between them in fascination. Katsumi had started growing quickly after her birth. Already, she was 6 pounds and had sprouted long limbs. She looked like a fucking muppet, but Izuku refused to let him dress her as Kermit the Frog. Not that he still didn't when he got together with Kirishima and Ochako. Mina had been exiled from baby time after she couldn't control her quirk in the baby's presence the first time. She was still a far cry from how big most pups were even born at, but she was growing. That was the biggest thing. Her small size and uncooperative limbs seemed to be the bane of her existence and the predominant reason for her fussy crying. When she fussed and cried. So far, she'd been a pretty quiet baby, and Katsuki couldn't have been more thankful. All of her extra energy that didn't go to crying or growing limbs twice her size seemingly went into mass-producing hair just like her damn father. While her eyes were still the vibrant red of Katsuki's, her hair had become a bushel of green curls that he just knew he'd be fighting for the rest of his natural life. 10 minutes later, Aizawa snapped his book closed at the front of the class. Take 15. Midnight will be here soon. Without preamble, he strode from the room to leave his rowdy students to their chaos. Katsuki groaned, stretching one arm over his head and then the other to keep Katsumi still. In her sling, Katsumi's mouth pulled away. She started to whine against his skin. Fishing her out to wiggle his fingers in her face, he said without looking, "Deku, can you take Katsumi? I need to piss." Izuku swooped in beside him, pressing a kiss to Katsuki's temple as he scooped up the baby. She was dressed in an all-might onesie that was still a little big on her, but Katsuki had modified it in the important places. "Of course I can. How's my beautiful baby girl doing?" he cooed, pressing kisses all over her face and stomach as she giggled. Katsuki stood, stretching again before returning the kiss. "She probably needs a change before midnight gets here. I didn't change her before this period. She might be dry, but you should check." He shoved his hands deep into his pockets to keep from reaching for her again. He trusted Izuku implicitly with Katsumi, but there was always a bit of anxiety when he let her go. Izuku wasn't the problem in this equation, it was the rest of the idiots who got up to coo at the little green-haired baby. If he didn't have to pee, he wouldn't leave their sides for an instant, but if he were actually being honest, he needed a moment to himself. You know, before she starts screaming. She needs to be burped too. Give her 5 more minutes, and then check if she needs a change. Before he left, he turned to Kirishima. "Don't let Mineta anywhere near them. If I find him within 10 feet of her again, I will string him up by his ankles at the front gate." Looking aggrieved, but in complete agreement, Kirishima nodded. Izuku didn't look up at he nodded as well, spending the time blowing a raspberry against her cheek to make her giggle again. "I can do that," he said before exclaiming, "You've been eating so much, but it's all going to your hair." Turning, Katsuki quickly left the room, ignoring the urge to snap the necks of everyone that crowded around Izuku in his wake. He'd just have to trust Kirishima, which he also did, to keep them mostly at bay. Instead of taking a urinal, Katsuki locked himself in a stall. When he was done, he just pressed his back to the door. He scrubbed at his eyes with the back of his wrists. He was tired, so fucking tired. Between class, homework, training, and the baby, it felt like he never slept. Which was a lie. Katsumi never cried at night. Both his and Izuku's bodies were set on a timer now, and rarely did they not wake up before she even began to murmur. So, they never got the jerk of surprise from being woken by a cry. Waking up every couple of hours was still waking up every couple of hours though. So far, Katsuki had only woken up 3 times to find Katsumi nursing while Izuku dosed with the 2 of them pulled to his chest, the baby cradled between them. And there had only been 4 times when Izuku didn't even twitch a muscle when Katsuki rose to get her from her crib. Still he was tired. He knew he would be. That was at least something that had been consistent in his research. He had been tired for 10 straight months, and he was likely to be until Katsumi could at least make a sandwich on her own. With a heavy sigh, he moved to push himself away from the door, but stopped when he heard the bathroom door open again. "Yo, like what the fuck is up with that?" a voice asked, unfamiliar, but most voices were. He didn't usually pay enough attention to other students enough to recognize people he didn't see as frequently as his classmates. "What's up with what?" Another unfamiliar voice. "That prick from 3A carrying around a baby. What the fuck is his name again? Bakugu or something? Dude, didn't you see the news? That's the baby he rescued during that huge battle a month ago." The first voice scoffed. "That's a load of crap, and you know it. Did you know he's an Omega?" "Yes. He's part of the Big 3 and he's one of the only male Omegas in the hero course. Do you even go to this school? What are you on about? Are you jealous that he's a better hero than you, or just mad that he's not your Omega?" "Me? Jealous of that asshole?" As if, the first voice laughed, "That baby is his for sure. He probably fucked his way to the top and got pregnant doing it. Bet if I asked nicely, he'd get on his knees like the slut he is. I'd show him what a real alpha is supposed to be. He'd never get enough dash." Having heard enough, Katsuki kicked open the stall door, breaking the lock and the hinges in one fell swoop. "Oh shit," the holder of the second voice whispered, eyes widening as he stood up straight from where he'd been leaning against a skin. Darkly, Katsuki traced his eyes over the alpha standing still in front of a urinal, lingering on his dick in his hands. He smirked, stuffing his hands in his pockets. Like you could ever hope to be enough of an alpha to handle me. I would wreck you, he growled, stepping past the broken stall door to stand next to him, like you'd be enough of an alpha to handle my mate. His eyes dropped to the alpha's dick again as he sneered. Pathetic. Omega or not, baby or not, I'm still going to be the top in the end. With that very specific, very pointed double entendre, he headed for the door. He stopped by the other student who was cowering by the sink. The boy stunk of the other alpha, but the scent was forced, not mixed like it was with him and Izuku. Their coupling clearly wasn't a happy one. He clapped the student on the shoulder, and the boy flinched. Listen, Omega, I'm only going to say this once. Don't settle for an alpha just because you think you need to make it at this school as a hero. You're better than the likes of him. There are way better people out there to be your mate and friend. You can stand on your own 2 feet just fine. He left before either student could get their faculties about them. Katsuki and Izuku were on the couch watching Ochako float a giggling Katsumi in her lap when Katsuki's phone rang. Picking it up, he immediately yelled, "Kirishima, catch!" before chucking it across the common room. "Ah man, not again," Kirishima whined as he caught the phone to answer it brightly. "Mrs. Bakugu, hi. No, he's not available right now. He's at training with All Might." "Yeah, I'll tell him." "No, I don't think he's avoiding you." He shot Katsuki a heated look before returning to the call. "He's just really busy right now with practicals and finals coming up." "Yeah, I'll tell him." Bye. Kirishima walked back to him, phone in hand. "Man, stop avoiding your mom. You're going to have to talk to her at some point." Katsuki sneered. "Like hell I do." "Kaken, you still haven't talked to your parents?" Izuku asked, pinning him with an admonishing glare. "You can't say shit to me. You haven't told your mom about Katsumi either?" Katsuki spat back, standing to sit on the floor beside Ochako. He wiggled his fingers in Katsumi's face and she grabbed for them, face scrunching when she couldn't quite catch them. When he stilled long enough for her to grip his fingers, she immediately stuffed them in her mouth. Izuku's face reddened and he stuttered, I'm just waiting for the perfect moment. I don't want to tell her over the phone. And I don't want to wake up with a knife to my throat. I'm saving your ass too. She'll kill me, but she'll hang you outside the front door like a flag and you know it." Izuku groaned, but didn't protest as he dropped his face into his hands. "She's just going to be more angry the longer we wait." Ochako sighed. "I know that Mr. Aizawa said it was your jobs to tell your parents about this since you're adults, loosely defined, but this is honestly a childish way to go about it. You can't hide this from her forever. She already knows you're hiding something. You need to stop hiding and get this over with." "Give me back my baby," Katsuki growled without much heat. "No, she's having fun," Ochako retorted, smacking away his other hand as it reached for Katsumi. "Anyway, just meet them at the mall or something. Take All Might with you to run interference or explain or something. Just get it over with. We have some time coming up, and you should tell them before we're completely swamped." "We're already swamped." Ochako started. Izuku cut in before she could say something that would actually make Katsuki take Katsumi upstairs. "That's a good point and a good idea. I'll talk to All Might." Katsuki groaned loudly, but didn't protest. Silently, he just started to plan his and Izuku's joint funeral. Katsuki desperately combed his fingers through Katsumi's honest-to-God mane of hair, trying to untangle the strands in an attempt to calm himself. Were babies even supposed to be able to make that much hair? Katsuki was pretty sure that he had seen a picture of a completely bald 3-year-old Izuku from when they were kids. Was the hair growth his fault? He did have to cut his hair pretty often to keep it even mildly under control, so maybe. Honestly though, this seemed excessive. She'd gained another 2 pounds in the past 2 weeks as well. Was she growing too fast? His mind was all over the place, and it was frustrating. There was no way to calm him down. Not for him and not for Izuku, who was currently giving All Might an in-depth rundown of the most prominent heroes of the 22nd century in excruciating detail. He was a complete babbling mess, and he probably wasn't making much, if any, sense at the moment. Katsuki wouldn't know. He had effectively shut out all sound except for Katsumi's happy cooing and giggling. Izuku's incessant rambling would only make him that much more anxious. Katsumi grabbed onto his finger, clamping down on it with her toothless gums. He smiled down at her despite his nerves, but his happiness was short-lived as Izuku went silent beside him. Stiffening, he lifted his head. After some discussion with All Might and Aizawa, they decided to meet with their parents at the mall like Ochako had suggested. There was a park nearby that they were planning on moving the group to where Mitsuki could no likely berate and yell at them to her heart's desire. The mall had been the first stage of the plan to keep down any violence that may arise. Katsuki just hoped it worked. Inko, Mitsuki and Masaru walked shoulder to shoulder, making people part around them rather than making a single line. The mall was packed to capacity, loud and crowded, which they had been counting on, but now only made Katsuki nauseous. There were so many eyes that could see them, so many ears that could overhear them. He wanted to be sick. They waited in silent terror as Mitsuki spotted them, waving wildly. Katsuki clutched Katsumi close to his chest as her voice became clear. His face wouldn't cooperate to drop into his usual scowl, and he had settled for an apprehensive grimace, gnawing at the inside of his lip. Curiously, Katsumi patted his cheek. He tore his eyes away from his approaching death sentence just for a second to smile down at her again. "My little monster. My little girl," he thought softly before Mitsuki effectively ripped him out of his safe haven. "Izuku, brat. You don't contact us for months, get in a fight, end up in the hospital where we were banned from seeing you, and still don't answer my calls for another month and a half? What kind of explanation do you have?" Mitsuki shouted genially, but Katsuki knew that her looking happy and nice was worse than her anger showing. It meant she was furious. Katsuki was legitimately terrified for both his and Izuku's lives. Izuku stepped forward, edging himself between Katsuki and their approaching parents. "Mom, Mr. Bakugu, Mrs. Bakugu, we're sorry. It's been really busy lately, especially after everything that happened." Mitsuki stopped in front of Izuku, hands on her hips. "How many times do I have to tell you to call us Mitsuki and Masaru? We've known you since you were still in diapers." "Alright," Izuku mumbled before Inko wrapped him in a close hug. Peeking over his shoulder though, Katsuki could see her eyes trained on him, and her gentle smile was the only thing that marginally put him at ease. Until his mother zeroed in on him. "I wasn't talking about you anyway, Izuku. I was mainly talking to my no-good brat that's been having his friend answer my calls for him." Her expression turned dangerous as Inko held Izuku in place, and Masaru and Mitsuki stepped around him. "Wait." Izuku tried, but All Might set a hand on his shoulder. "You can't protect him forever, young Midoriya," he said lowly even as he left Izuku's side to stand beside Katsuki. Masaru's eyes were as soft as ever even as understanding immediately dawned on his face at the baby in Katsuki's arms. His smile became a little more strained, but he still pulled Katsuki into his arms. "It's good to see you're okay, son. Do you want to introduce us to the little one? Right? That's the little tyke you saved during that battle, right?" Mitsuki asked, momentarily forgetting about admonishing Katsuki for inspecting Katsumi. She was sitting up against his arm, eyes wide and interested as Mitsuki crowded her space. "She's a cute one, isn't she? What's her name again? The news never said. Look at all that green hair and those red eyes. What a cutie. She looks really young too." Mitsuki laughed uproariously. "I'd almost believe she was yours, but that's crazy. She looks exactly like Dash." She stopped immediately as her eyes popped up to take in Katsuki's expression, and the wide smile dropped away. Katsuki took a step away from his parents, turning his body so that Katsumi was protected, but so that he could still see them. Masaru's hands settled on Mitsuki's stiff shoulders. "Mitsuki, honey, let's dash." "Shut up," she snapped, eyes never leaving Katsuki. Her scent flared, strong and very, very alpha. Any patrons that were close to them scattered, staring wide-eyed at their group. Katsuki didn't see Izuku move, but he was between them suddenly, teeth bared and scent clashing with Mitsuki's. Inko stared back with astonished eyes, arms outstretched in his sudden absence. They were all still for several long heartbeats. All Might stepped between the two groups. Even in his small form, he was intimidatingly tall and took command of the situation. "This is not the place for this talk. There's a park close by. Young Midoriya, young Bakugu, please lead the way. Mr. and Mrs. Bakugu, Mrs. Midoriya, please stay behind me while we walk. I know you're anxious for answers, but like I said, this is not the place. Unwillingly, Izuku turned and ran a finger over Katsumi's cheek before starting in the direction of the park with Katsuki. Slipping a trembling hand down Katsuki's arm, he threaded their fingers. It took 15 minutes of very, very tense silence for them to reach the park. It was eerily empty, which was less comforting than he wanted it to be. Katsuki and Izuku stopped in the grass of a small field, turning to face the rest of the group, and almost immediately, Mitsuki was in Katsuki's face. Take Katsumi, Katsuki said quickly because he wasn't about to be stepped all over by his mother. Not over this. Not over something so important to him. She had no right to be angry. He was her child, but this was his body and his mate and his baby. Izuku couldn't fight his battles for him, and he didn't want him to. Get back. Izuku bundled Katsumi against his chest, backing up quickly as Mitsuki advanced. You've got to be shitting me, Katsuki. Are you fucking serious? She roared at the top of her lungs. You're really fucking serious here. A baby and a mate. And you didn't think that was something fucking important to tell us about? You were pregnant in that battle, weren't you? Do you know what could have happened? You're 18, Katsuki. You're still in school. I can't believe you'd be so fucking careless. I didn't raise you to take these risks. Why you like this? Stop yelling at me, Mom. Katsuki snarled back, arms outstretched to his sides and palms crackling as more of a quick defense rather than a call to fight. I'm not having this fucking argument with you. I've heard it from everyone. I know I'm 18, I know how stupid it was, but guess what? I wouldn't change anything I did. You don't get to tell me how I should have acted. This is my body and my mate and my baby, and you don't get to tell me when I should feel comfortable enough to talk to you about something you're literally freaking out about. You should have told us. What are you supposed to fucking do? Is all of this to ask us to what? Take care of your baby while you run off to be a hero? That you're dropping out of school? What the actual fuck, Katsuki? You have got to be fucking kidding me, old hag. You don't know me at all, do you? Katsuki took a purposeful step forward, feeling malicious as he said, I'm not you. Just because you regret having me so earlier and regret how I turned out doesn't mean I will. My baby is my responsibility. He wanted to make her back down. He wanted to make her hurt before she hurt him instead, but even as the words fell from his lips, there was shame. There was nothing in the world that should have made him throw that in her face, even if it was how she'd made him feel for years. Guess he wasn't as grown up as he'd thought. He caught sight of Katsumi out of the corner of his eye, and his expression dropped. Katsumi's bottom lip was trembling, big red eyes filling with tears, fists balled up by her cheeks. Katsumi he started when he was sent to the ground. He gripped his stinging cheek as he glared, and copper and salt filled his mouth. She's hit him hard. All Might stepped forward quickly, but already too late. Mitsuki's cheeks were red as tears filled her eyes, chest heaving. You don't get to talk to me like that, you sorry excuse dash. A loud cry split the air, and Katsuki completely forgot about their argument as he scrambled over to his daughter and mate. She wailed, face red and eyes scrunched together. Shh, don't cry, baby, he murmured, cupping her small face in his hands to run his thumbs beneath her eyes. He pressed a kiss to her nose and her cheeks and her forehead as Izuku gentle bounced her. They purred in tandem, and slowly Katsumi's cries died off until she was just sniffling. There you are. That's my little monster. Where's that big smile? Slowly, Katsumi's sniffling stopped and a wide toothless grin replaced her scowl. Izuku leaned into Katsuki, pressing their foreheads together. There she is. Izuku cooed, beautiful baby girl. No more tears. No more yelling. They both stiffened when they heard the telltale hitch of breath from behind them. For a moment, they'd forgotten there were even other people around, and they grimaced at each other before turning. Inko's face was a wreck of tears and snot as she held tightly to Mitsuki. The other woman's eyes were still filled with tears, but she held onto Inko's shoulders as she looked on. The angry flush had drained from her face, and a grudgingly prideful expression had replaced it. I'll admit, brat, she said, jaw working, I wasn't expecting that from you. You actually love that baby, don't you? Of course I love her, he muttered. I carried her for 9 fucking months. I wouldn't have put myself through that if I didn't. Her name's Katsumi, not that baby. Izuku grinned widely. What he's not saying is that he primarily did it alone because he didn't tell me until 8 months in. Katsuki turned a withering glare on his mate. You're really never going to let me live that down, are you? Absolutely not. The 3 parents crowded forward even as Inko continued to cry, and All Might let out an audible sigh from behind them. Inko was sobbing, and her tears were not happy ones. But Izuku, what are you going to do about school? What are they going to do? They're not kicking you out, are they? You're almost graduated. All Might did step in this time, waving his hands quickly. No, Mrs. Midoriya, not at all. They are only a month and a half from graduation now, and we didn't know anything about this until the birth was already taking place. There wasn't much we could do, and honestly, the faculty wasn't willing to expel the 2 top students in the school. I'll be honest, I don't think they would have even if this had been discovered earlier. Special accommodations have been made for the time being. You're lucky your teachers like you, Mitsuki growled. Katsuki snapped his teeth at her in response before both he and Izuku said, they don't. All Might sighed again as if they were personally stripping years off his life, which was fair and probably true. There was a moment before anger clouded Mitsuki's face again, but she didn't turn her ire on Katsuki this time. Instead, she swung her finger in Izuku's direction. You fucking touched my son. Izuku sputtered, face going red, but didn't have time to answer before she swung on All Might next. How the hell did you not notice? I should rip you both new assholes. Rest assured, I'll be having a discussion with the both of you. Stop yelling, old hag, you're going to make Katsumi cry again, Katsuki groaned, turning Izuku's body into his so that Katsumi was squished between them and couldn't see the commotion. The meet-up restructured into what it should have been at the beginning. Katsuki kept an eagle eye on the 3 parents as they passed Katsumi around, and told them about the pregnancy and the birth. Izuku told them the embarrassing details Katsuki didn't mention. Inko and Masaru fondly told stories about Izuku and Katsuki as babies. Yes, Katsuki was in fact the reason Katsumi was a hair factory. They were both the reason she was now starting to grow so fast after the first month of seemingly snail-paced growth. They were both also, surprisingly, the reason she'd been born so small. Izuku was only 3 pounds, 7 ounces when he was born. Inko explained, smiling, he was born a month early, but I don't think he would have been even 7 pounds if I'd carried to term. But he was always eager for the world, even in the womb. Right? And Katsuki wasn't much bigger. You were only 5 pounds even though you were technically 2 weeks early. I think we just got the date of conception wrong, Mitsuki explained flippantly as she twisted one of Katsumi's curls around her finger. Katsuki sneered. You didn't know immediately? No, brat, I didn't. Not everyone has a weird omega sixth sense like that. I don't even think most omegas can tell that early. I'm an alpha. I wasn't even supposed to be able to get pregnant. And clearly it never happened again. Masaru smiled patiently at her. Honey, you didn't know for the first 3 months that you were pregnant. What? How did you not know for 3 months? Katsuki shouted. Mitsuki shrugged. I didn't have any symptoms. Or I guess, let's put it this way. I thought the symptoms were from other things I was doing. What the fuck does that even mean? Let's just say that your mother was very outgoing when she was 20, Masaru explained. Jesus. Are you about to tell me Mom was a gang leader or something? Or something, Masaru said with a small smile. Inko's head popped up. Right? Wasn't your group called the Red Butterflies or Red Dragons or something? You guys were terrifying. I was so scared of you when we were in school. Mitsuki laughed loudly, and Katsumi startled in her lap, eyes going wide. She didn't cry this time though, beginning to grow familiar with her grandmother's loud nature. Oh, that brings back some good memories. So, this is where Kakin gets it from. I get it now. Izuku said thoughtfully at his side, and Katsuki punched him in the shoulder. He laughed, pushing Katsuki in return, which started a whole thing. All Might stepped around and over them, muttering, Boys, please, there are people watching, as they tumbled and wrestled in the grass. It had been a long time since they'd gotten to just have fun, longer since they'd been able to truly roughhouse with each other without their quirks. When they sparred, it was always fun rather than aggressive like it used to be, but there was just something different about truly roughhousing just for the fun of it without anything to gain. They tossed each other across the grass, and snapped their teeth, and laughed as they hit the ground time and time again. They came to a stop with heaving chests and wide smiles when Katsuki pinned Izuku's hands next to his head. "You still can't win against me, nerd," Katsuki panted. Izuku laughed, eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "No, guess I can't." His voice dropped to a whisper, red tinting his cheeks. "I want to kiss you right now." Katsuki glanced surreptitiously at their parental figures, which included All Might. They'd been watching them before, but now their attention was completely focused on Katsumi again. "Just one," he said and leaned down. The kiss was chaster than he would have preferred, but he couldn't very well make out with his mate right there where literally everyone and their mothers could see them. So he had to be satisfied with a quick swipe of their tongues against each other and a bite of Izuku's lower lip before he pushed himself away. When it was time for them to leave, All Might held Katsumi as they hugged their parents goodbye. "Take good care of my baby," Inko whispered to Katsuki, and he nodded minutely. "You're going to do great, son," Masaru told him before pressing a kiss to his forehead that Katsuki absolutely abhorred. Mitsuki held him for several moments longer than she normally would have, which was already long because they rarely hugged. "I want to be mad about this," she said as she pulled away, "but I can't be. Katsumi is beautiful, and from what I saw today, you're going to be a great dad." Katsuki could only gawk at her as the trio headed off back towards the mall where the car had been parked. "Wow," Izuku whispered, expression identical to Katsuki's. Everything started to speed up after that, and Katsumi's growth marked the time with ever-increasing increments. Finals were just a month away, written and then practicals. Licensing exams would be the day after practicals, and then they would be home free. The biggest hurdle for the class as a whole was going to be the written exam. They spent hours all crammed into the common room, poring over their textbooks and notes, comparing answers to the homework Aizawa had assigned and quizzing each other at the end of the night. Katsuki and Izuku, confident in their skill to pass the written exam, were only there to assist the studying process. They would have just said fuck it and used the extra time to sleep, but they needed to give Katsumi tummy time and experience new things, so they helped. Katsumi held Katsuki's fingers in her chubby little fists as she stood on trembling legs. She bounced tentatively, staring down at her unsteady feet. "There you go, baby girl, you're doing great. You're going to be walking in no time." She squealed at his words, bouncing more confidently. She dropped to the floor and struggled back up only to repeat the movement again. When he glanced over to his table of idiot friends, he found several heads jerking back down to textbooks. "Hey, dumbass," he shouted, "if you want to pass your fucking tests, focus on your studies. You're never going to pass if you let yourself get distracted." "But you two are just so cute," Kaminari whined plaintively, dropping his chin on the edge of the table with a sigh. "Come on, just let us play with her for a bit too. Not until you can solve this set of math problems. I keep telling you, dunce. They're not that hard." The table seemed to perk up, all eyes bright. "If we finish them, then can we play with her?" Jiro asked carefully, eyebrows inching towards her hairline. Cocking his head, Katsuki narrowed his eyes. "Sure, whatever. Just finish those math problems with any success, and I'll set aside tummy time." "This?" Kirishima hissed, scribbling across his paper faster. The others followed his lead, all attention directed to their homework with singular determination. Katsuki smirked at Katsumi. "You're gonna get so much attention from this, and those idiots are gonna study. A win-win situation here, baby girl," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. She lowered to the ground, but this time released his fingers to drop to her hands. Izuku's arms wrapped around Katsuki's shoulders, and he turned his head to accept the incoming kiss. "Please don't pimp out our baby to get the others to study. I'm not. Like I said, it's a win-win situation. She gets stimulation, they get an incentive and a break. Speaking of which..." He turned back to find Katsumi scooting herself on her stomach with all the force of her knees, staring determinedly at Kirishima's leg. "AG incoming. Don't let her hit the table leg." Kirishima dropped his pencil. He turned to face her, opening his arms as she scooted forward. When her fingers wrapped around his, dragging herself the last few inches, he scooped her up and held her above his head. "Sumi! Baby!" he shouted, and she shouted in response, squealing excitedly as her legs kicked. Cuddling her close, he nuzzled against her cheeks, pressing kisses all over her face and scenting her profusely. "No fair," Kaminari whined, looking anguished in math hell. "Why does Kiri get baby time?" Almost as soon as he spoke, Katsumi slapped Kirishima in the nose. He groaned as he lowered her back to the ground, and she immediately made her way back to her parents. Katsuki smirked. Well, clearly she knew that it's not baby time just yet. Get back to work. The group continued to whine, but didn't argue as they went back to their books. Katsumi was cradled between Izuku and Katsuki, a rare treat for all three of them. She'd started to sleep through the night, which was good, but there were still nights where she refused to settle down unless she was between them. They'd made it a point to never let her sleep in their bed, but sometimes they couldn't help except to cave. Arm outstretched and pinned beneath Izuku's head, Katsuki stared at the pair. Katsumi slept just like Izuku, flat on her back, mouth wide open and unapologetic, dead to the world. She was cuddled in the crook of his arm, head pillowed against his bicep. Her feet pedaled slowly in her sleep. He sighed, letting his eyes drift closed. Since Katsumi had been sleeping through the night, he'd started to sleep longer as well, but there were still times where he jolted into consciousness, ready to attend to a baby who didn't need him. Sometimes it took longer than others to drift back to sleep. It seemed to be one of those nights. So, instead, he listened to his mates and baby's steady breathing, Izuku muttering in his sleep, the settling of the building around them. This time a week from now, they'd be in the apartment that his parents had helped them find, and they'd be heroes. They'd finally be heroes, climbing the ranks with single-minded determination, and they'd be raising Katsumi without anyone else's input. As he drifted, he wondered if there was anyone else awake. If they were worried about the practicals. If they were too excited. If they were doing what he was doing and staring at his mate. If they were still scared they'd never become heroes. But they were way past worrying now. They were almost there. All of them. The buzzers screamed overhead, signaling the end of the practical exams. Katsuki panted, face splashed with oil and his own blood. His skin steamed, hot beneath the freezing rain he'd been made to fight in. The rain stopped, and he stared around in a daze. Several of the others were around him, including a few from 3B, but Izuku was nowhere to be seen. They'd been split up before the exam. The practical had been a combination of everything they'd learned in those 3 years. Rescue efforts, battle, teamwork, and so on. It had been hard, just like every exam they'd ever had, but there was no doubt in his mind they'd all made it. "Come on, man," Kirishima said with an unsteady grin as he gripped Katsuki's shoulder. "Let's go get our scores." Together with the others, they trudged back to the main area of the exam arena. Already, the scores were being projected over the stage. And right there, tied for first place, were Katsuki and Izuku's names. "You came in first. Way to go, man," Kirishima yelled in his ear, but he wasn't listening as he looked over the sea of students for that familiar tuft of green curls. He could barely smell Izuku on the air, everyone's scents mixing and intermingling to make it impossible to trace where the scent was coming from. Growling out his frustration, he turned in a slow circle. "Kaken!" Katsuki spun towards Izuku's voice, catching him as he flew into him. Strong legs wrapped around his waist and stronger arms around his neck as Izuku sobbed uncontrollably. "We did it! We did it! Kaken, we finally did it!" Izuku shouted, smothering his words against Katsuki's mouth as he kissed him over and over again. Katsuki couldn't help the laughter that spilled from him. "We still have to pass the licensing exam, dummy." He held Izuku tight against his body, hands gripping his hips, and asked to hold him in place. Izuku rolled his eyes. "Compared to this, that's going to be a cinch. But we're going to blow it out of the water." "You two already did that here," Ochako said with a grin, finally catching up from where Izuku had literally leapt away from her. Kirishima laughed. "Yeah, man, give the rest of us a chance." The others were slowly starting to appear, crowding around them and staring up at the screen. There were no names that had less than a passing score, and that was all that mattered. And then there was Ida. Have some decorum, you two. We are still on school grounds. Please get off of each other. Katsuki and Izuku looked him straight in the eyes as they sealed their mouths back together before closing their own in pure bliss. The rest of the class laughed as Ida screamed in frustration. Katsuki and Izuku bolted from the arena after the closing remarks had been given, forgoing changing their clothes in favor of hunting down Aizawa and All Might, who had been babysitting Katsumi in the stadium seating. They found them just outside the front doors, holding Katsumi up between them as she bounced on her unsteady little legs to music someone was playing nearby. She saw them as soon as they saw her, and she screamed excitedly. "Hi, baby, we're back," Izuku said, scooping her up against his chest and smothering her in kisses. "How was the exam?" All Might asked, smiling at the sight. "Fine. Shit was easy," Katsuki said, pulling off his glove to run his hand over Katsumi's hair. His hand was still sweaty, but sweat was better than the oil and blood he was still covered in. "We tied for first. Icy Hot didn't even come close." Izuku pulled back to look at their teachers, but Katsumi had a hold of his bottom lip, so his voice was distorted when he said, "Come on, Todoroki did really well. Everyone did. No one failed, even in 3B. We all passed with flying colors." "Flying colors might be giving some of those idiots too much credit," Katsuki grumbled, carefully detaching Katsumi from Izuku's lip. He kissed her fingertips, and she tried to make a grab for his lip instead. "No, I don't think so, monster. I've got a cut on the inside of my lip and I don't need you sticking your finger in it." "You two should go change," All Might suggested, but didn't move to take Katsumi back. "Then find Recovery Girl and get something to eat. You still have the licensing exams tomorrow," Aizawa said, always pragmatic. Students were beginning to pour from the building, loud and boisterous with their victories. "We can hold on to her until you're changed." Izuku sighed, but neither moved. Once they got their hands back on their baby, it was always difficult to give her up again. "We'll just wait until everyone is out of the doorway. That way we don't have to force our way through them." All Might laughed. "You're not fooling anyone, young Midoriya." "I know," he replied with a grin. Katsuki, Izuku and their teachers watched the never-ending stream of students. They hadn't been the only ones taking exams in the stadium, they'd just been the only ones in the open arena area. They whispered as they passed, eyes glued to Izuku and Katsuki, who were all but used to the attention by now. People usually didn't stare so hard though, and Katsuki's temper was beginning to rise with each whispered comment and pair of eyes blatantly staring at them. "If one more motherfucker dash," Katsuki started, but of course, there was someone else worse than all the other bystanders. Monoma, I wouldn't dash." Monoma cut Izuku off with a loud raucous laugh that startled Katsumi enough that she scowled. "Look at that cutie. So adorable for coming from the two of you. Guess you really are just a bitch in heat like I always thought. How hilarious. The top two students can't even keep it in their pants through high school. Teenage parents, what a disgrace." He was laughing wildly as he pointed at them. Everyone within hearing distance went stock still as shock rippled through the crowd, and if Monoma hadn't been so close to them where Katsumi could get caught in the blast, Katsuki would have blown the whole area straight into the sky. "Hey man, not fucking cool," Kirishima snarled, more vicious than he ever was, latching onto the back of Monoma's neck. Before he could pull the idiot away, Katsumi lunged out of Izuku's arms and bit down into Monoma's hand right in the meat below his thumb. "Katsumi!" Izuku cried, pulling her away as quickly as she had shot forward. A string of bloody saliva was connected to her mouth, but she just laughed. "Oh my god, where's the blood from?" Monoma screamed, staring down at his hand as blood welled from 4 puncture marks. A bruise had already begun to bloom where her gums had chomped down. "You're going to be a hero, shut up." "That was totally unmanly," Kirishima growled, swinging Monoma towards the classes by the back of his neck. "Kendo! You out here? Can you come get this idiot?" "Yeah. I'm over here." Kendo called from the front of the students, waving her hand above her head. "I'll take him over. Let's have a talk." "Stop screaming," Aizawa grumbled, replacing Kirishima's hand and steering Monoma in her direction. To the rest of the students, he called, "Clear out. The show's over." Immediately, the crowd started to move again. Kirishima crowded in beside Katsuki as Izuku set Katsumi down in her carrier. "Is she okay?" he asked. Frantically, Izuku ripped off his gloves and pressed his thumbs to her lips. "Let Papa see you, mouth baby. I've got to check to make sure you didn't hurt yourself." Katsumi opened her mouth, chomping down on his thumbs as he did his best to look in. "Izuku, your hands are dirty," Katsuki snapped. "I didn't think she was going to bite my thumbs." Izuku shot back, but didn't move as he inspected her gums. "Look though, Kaken." "What?" Panic slid home in his chest, and he shoved up right against Izuku's shoulder to look into her mouth. 4 sharp little points poked out of broken skin, 2 in her top gums and 2 in her bottom. "Sekinens," Katsuki stuttered, unable to tear his eyes away, and then a groan slipped from his mouth. "Fuck me, this is going to make breastfeeding so much worse." Izuku laughed, pulling his thumbs out of her mouth, and her face scrunched up as she reached for his hands again. "Maybe, but wasn't it worth it to see her bite Monoma?" Katsuki ran a hand down his face. "We'll find out in a few hours." The countdown to graduation was a flurry and blur of days after that. As Izuku had said, licensing exams were far easier than the practicals, and not a day later, they were all certified heroes. Full boxes littered the dorm halls, and Aizawa had to break up more than one rowdy party in those few days. The day of graduation left their dorm empty and silent as they filed out to make their way to the school. Katsuki's arms felt uncomfortably empty. All Might had taken Katsumi to leave her with Mitsuki, Masaru and Inko somewhere in the crowd, but still, he was anxious without her. Beside him, Izuku threaded their fingers together, smiling. Once the ceremony was done, and they'd followed the tide of students out the front gate, they stood off to the side while they waited for their parents to find them. "It's kind of bittersweet and sad, you know," Izuku asked, staring longingly up at the gate. "We've spent 3 amazing years here, grown so much, and now it's over. It's kind of scary." Katsuki shrugged, looking over their classmates instead as they screamed and cried and jumped all over each other. "Maybe, but there's a whole lot better shit to look forward to. No more classes, no more training, just being the #1 hero. Nothing can stop us now." A grin slit Izuku's face. "Yeah, you're right." Izuku leaned in for a kiss, but sobbing bodies crashed into them both, and the moment was pushed for another time as they turned into the arms of their friends. Katsuki and Izuku sat at one end of a long table while their old classmates drunk themselves into oblivion around them. It was rare that everyone could get together in the same place, so when they could, they made it a whole event. Matching studs glittered gold in Katsuki and Izuku's left earlobes and rings shone with diamonds on their left hands. They only wore their wedding bands in their off time because really, no one wanted a degloved finger. The studs stood in place of their rings when they worked. A television up in the corner of the room played the evening news, and the group had quieted enough to watch the 30-minute segment. As much as they wanted to ignore it, a habit was a habit. And this was one habit they'd all picked up in the 3 years since graduating school. "It seems to be a rather quiet night in the city today, thanks to the brave heroes that protect us every day." Speaking of heroes, let's talk about the news that came out earlier this afternoon. A picture of Katsuki and Izuku in their hero uniforms was superimposed over the news anchor's face as they continued to speak. Sitting on Izuku's shoulders, Katsumi smiled as wide as he did, waving. Her hair cascaded down her back in a waterfall of green curls, and she stuck her tongue through the gap between her front 2 teeth. Cradled in their arms were a pair of newborns peering blearily at the camera to reveal 2 sets of bloody eyes. Soft hair covered their heads, one blonde and the other green. The news broke just this afternoon that the top 2 heroes, #1 hero Ground Zero and #2 hero Deku, are taking a month off for maternity and paternity leave. We hadn't seen either of them for a few days, but was anyone even aware that Ground Zero was pregnant? We have definitely been seeing less of him over the past few months, but that was assumed to be due to required downtime. No, apparently not. Beer spewed across the table, and Kaminari coughed uncontrollably, staring up at the screen with wet eyes. Everyone else was completely still. The pair only made their mating bond official at the end of the year when they tied the knot, but rumors have always been around that they've been mated since high school. This can be corroborated with their first child, Katsumi Bakugamidoriya, who celebrated her 3rd birthday at the beginning of this year. The picture faded so that they were staring at the news anchor again, whose eyebrows were raised suggestively. Well, we can say that Ground Zero and Deku have never been your typical heroes, but this is unprecedented. The news has already blown up on social media, and there are many voices out there loudly supporting the hero duo dash. The television went silent as someone shut it off. All eyes turned towards the aforementioned hero duo, who were staring down into their cups of coffee without comment. Close to them, Kirishima and Ochako gulped down their beers. Across from them, Shinso and Momo exchanged bills. "You have got to be kidding me," Jiru said, shell-shocked. "Again? Come on, you two. I thought you said you were never going to let him touch you again." Kaminari accused from her side, pointing a trembling finger at them down the table. Katsuki shrugged. "Well, he sure as fuck isn't anymore. I'll break his fingers." Izuku smiled over at him wanly. "You already did that, babe. And Idris. And this time Chaco's too." "Your legs then," Katsuki quipped back. The table exploded with conversation again, questions thrown their way that Izuku answered with a smile. They had actually been planning on telling their friends that night, but you know what? Katsuki thought this was better. He'd never been good with words anyway.